Athens, 399 before the Common Era. A man in his 70s stands trial before 500 citizens. The charges are impiety and corrupting the youth. The real crime is asking questions. His name is Socrates, and he will be dead within weeks, executed by the city he never left. Among the spectators sits a young aristocrat in his late 20s who will spend the rest of his life trying to understand what happened that day and why the best man he ever knew had to die. That young man was Plato. He would live another 50 years, found a school that lasted 9 centuries, and write dialogues that people still read more than 2 millennia later. But he never got over watching Athens kill his teacher. Everything he wrote, everything he taught, everything he built was an attempt to answer a single question. How does a city end up executing its wisest citizen? The answer he developed would reshape Western thought, not just philosophy, but politics, education, science, art, religion. Christianity absorbed his ideas about the soul and the afterlife. Renaissance painters used his theory of ideal forms. Modern democracies still grapple with his critique of majority rule. Mathematicians work within frameworks he helped establish. The very word academy comes from the grove where he taught. Yet Plato never speaks in his own voice. He wrote dramatic dialogues, not treatises. His main character is Socrates, the teacher who wrote nothing himself. Plato hides behind his teacher's name, presenting ideas through conversations between characters who argue, contradict each other, often reach no clear conclusions. Readers must work to extract meaning, must think for themselves rather than receive doctrine passively. This makes understanding Plato difficult. His most important teachings were never written down at all, but shared only with advanced students behind closed doors. The oral doctrines are lost, known only through fragmentary reports. Even the written dialogues are puzzles. What does Plato actually believe? When Socrates says something in one dialogue that contradicts what he says in another, which represents Plato's view, or do neither? The difficulty is intentional. Plato thought philosophy cannot be poured into someone's mind like water into a jar. It must be drawn out through questioning, through examining assumptions, through following arguments to their conclusions. His dialogues are not meant to teach answers, but to provoke questions, to create the mental turbulence necessary for genuine understanding to emerge. At the center of his philosophy is a radical claim about reality. The world you see around you, the world of physical objects and bodies and change, is not the real world. It is a world of shadows and reflections and copies. The real world is invisible, accessible only to thought, eternal and unchanging. Everything you perceive with your senses is an imperfect imitation of perfect realities you cannot see. Most people live their entire lives never suspecting this, like prisoners chained in a cave watching shadows on a wall and mistaking them for reality. This sounds abstract, even mystical, but for Plato it was neither. It was the logical conclusion of examining how we actually know things, how we recognize qualities in different objects, how mathematics describes a world more perfect than anything physical. If you can prove that the angles of a triangle sum to 2 right angles, you are not proving something about any physical triangle. You are proving something about the perfect triangle that exists only in thought. Where is that perfect triangle? Not in the physical world, so there must be another realm, a realm of pure forms or ideas, more real than the world of matter. Consider 3 things: a circular coin, a wheel, a planet's orbit. They are different sizes, different materials, different purposes, yet you instantly recognize all as circular. What are you recognizing? Not the physical objects themselves, which are never perfectly round. You are recognizing something they all imperfectly approximate, the form of circle, which exists nowhere in the physical world but perfectly in thought. Every circular thing you have ever seen participates in this form, shares in its nature, but falls short of its perfection. The form itself never changes, never varies, never becomes more or less circular. It simply is circularity itself, the standard by which all circular things are measured and found imperfect. This theory of forms becomes the foundation for everything else. Political philosophy, because only those who have seen the forms know what is truly good for a city. Ethics, because virtue is knowledge of the forms. Education, because learning is remembering what the soul knew before birth when it existed in that other realm. Even love, which begins as physical attraction but should ascend through stages until it reaches love of beauty itself, the eternal form beyond all beautiful things. The implications are profound and disturbing. If the physical world is less real than the world of forms, then the body is less important than the soul. If true knowledge comes from reason rather than the senses, then philosophy is more valuable than any practical skill. If most people cannot perceive the forms, then most people live in ignorance, believing opinions rather than knowing truths. Democracy, ruled by the ignorant many, becomes the enemy of wisdom. Plato illustrated this with his most famous image. Imagine prisoners chained in an underground cave since childhood, unable to turn their heads, seeing only the wall before them. Behind them burns a fire. Between the fire and the prisoners, people carry objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners see only shadows, hear only echoes. They know nothing else. They would believe the shadows are reality itself, would develop expertise in predicting which shadows appear when, would honor as wise those who best predict the shadow sequence. Now imagine one prisoner freed. He turns, sees the fire, the objects casting shadows. The bright light hurts his eyes. He is confused, disoriented. Everything he believed was real turns out to be merely shadows of objects he never knew existed. If forced up a steep passage toward the cave's entrance, he would suffer, would resist, would want to return to the familiar darkness. But suppose he persists, emerges into sunlight. At first he can see nothing, blinded by the brightness. Gradually his eyes adjust. He sees reflections in water, then objects themselves. Then finally the sun, source of all light and life, making vision possible, causing the seasons and years, governing everything in the visible world, and in some way the cause of everything the prisoners see below. If he returned to the cave, his eyes now accustomed to sunlight, he would be blind in the darkness. He would stumble, unable to compete with the prisoners in their shadow games. They would mock him, would say his journey up destroyed his vision, would refuse to be led upward themselves. And if he tried to free them by force, to drag them toward the light, they would kill him if they could. The allegory is about education, about enlightenment, about philosophy. Most people live in the cave of illusion, mistaking shadows for reality, opinions for knowledge, conventional wisdom for truth. The philosopher escapes, sees the forms, understands reality. But returning to help others is dangerous, often fatal. Socrates returned to the cave. Athens executed him. Plato spent his life trying to understand why enlightenment threatens those who remain in darkness. Plato knew how this sounded. He knew people would reject it, would call him impractical, elitist, disconnected from reality, the same accusations they made against Socrates. But he thought the accusations came from people who had never examined their own assumptions, who accepted conventional wisdom without question, who confused familiarity with truth. The philosophical life requires courage, requires willingness to question everything, even the most basic beliefs about what is real and what matters. He tried once to put his ideas into practice. 3 times he traveled to Syracuse in Sicily, trying to educate its ruler in philosophy, hoping to create the philosopher king he wrote about. Each attempt failed, sometimes dangerously. He was nearly killed, possibly sold into slavery, and ransomed by friends. He returned to Athens accepting that the ideal city existed only in thought, that actual politics would always fall short, that the best he could do was educate individuals who might make their own souls just even if their cities remained unjust. The academy he founded became the model for all later universities. Students came from across the Greek world to study mathematics, astronomy, philosophy. They lived together, discussed together, pursued knowledge together. The school lasted until 529 of the Common Era, when a Christian emperor closed it as a pagan institution. By then, its influence had already spread throughout the Roman world, had been absorbed into Christian theology, had become part of the intellectual foundation of Western civilization. Plato died in his 80s, still teaching, still writing, still trying to lead students up from the cave of illusions toward the sunlight of truth. His greatest student, Aristotle, would reject much of what he taught, would create a rival philosophy, emphasizing observation and biology rather than mathematics and eternal forms. The rivalry between Platonism and Aristotelianism would shape philosophy for the next 2,000 years. Nearly every major philosopher would define themselves in relation to one or both of these ancient thinkers. Athens, in the late 5th century before the Common Era, was a city that had seen everything. Victory over the Persians, the construction of the Parthenon, the height of its empire, and then the long grinding war with Sparta that would eventually break it. Into this world, around 428 or 427, a boy was born to one of the city's most distinguished families. His father, Ariston, claimed descent from the ancient kings of Athens. His mother, Perictione, traced her line back to Solon, the legendary lawgiver. They named him Aristocles, though history would know him by his nickname Plato, possibly referring to his broad shoulders or forehead. The family expected certain things. Young men of their class received the finest education available. They learned poetry, music, gymnastics. They were groomed for political life to take their place among the city's leaders. Plato seemed destined for exactly this path. He wrote poetry in his youth. He trained as a wrestler. Everything pointed toward a conventional life of aristocratic privilege and public service. Then he met Socrates. The exact circumstances of their meeting remain unknown, but Plato was probably around 20 years old. Socrates was already famous, or infamous depending on who you asked. He spent his days in the marketplace and the gymnasiums, stopping people and asking them questions. Simple questions usually. What is courage? What is justice? What is knowledge? But the questions had a way of revealing that people who thought they knew these things actually did not. Socrates owned nothing, wanted nothing. He went barefoot, wore the same rough cloak in summer and winter. He had fought bravely in the war as a heavy infantryman, showing both physical courage and the ability to endure hardship that amazed his fellow soldiers. But he had no interest in the political career that his abilities might have brought him. He simply wanted to talk, to question, to examine. He claimed he knew nothing himself and was merely trying to learn from others. But somehow, by the end of his conversations, it was always the other person whose certainty had dissolved. For Plato, this encounter changed everything. He burned his poetry, according to later accounts. The conventional path no longer interested him. He became one of the young men who followed Socrates around the city, listening to these conversations, occasionally participating. For perhaps 8 years this continued. Plato absorbed not just ideas, but a method, a way of thinking that would shape everything he later wrote. Then came the disaster. Athens lost the war with Sparta. A brutal oligarchy took power, ruling through terror. Among the 30 tyrants were 2 of Plato's relatives. They tried to implicate Socrates in their crimes, ordering him to participate in the arrest of an innocent man. He refused. The regime fell after 8 months, and democracy returned. But the restored democracy harbored its own resentments. In 399, when Plato was about 28, Socrates was put on trial. The charges were impiety and corrupting the youth. The real reasons were more complex, tied up with politics and revenge and the city's trauma from the war and the tyranny. Socrates could have escaped. He could have proposed exile as his punishment. He did neither. He defended himself with the same questioning method that had made him famous, essentially daring the jury to condemn him. They did. By a vote of 280 to 221, they sentenced him to death. Plato was present at the trial. He offered to help pay a fine if Socrates would propose one. When the time came for Socrates to drink the hemlock, Plato was not there. Ancient sources say he was ill. Perhaps he could not bear to watch. Socrates spent his last day discussing the immortality of the soul with his friends, completely calm, treating death as simply another subject to examine. When the poison took effect, he died without complaint, still talking philosophy. For Plato, this was not just the loss of a teacher. It was a complete rupture with Athens, with democracy, with the entire political order that had killed the best man he had ever known. He left the city. For the next dozen years he traveled. He went to Megara, where other followers of Socrates had gathered. He may have gone to Egypt, to Cyrene, to southern Italy, where Pythagorean communities still existed. The details are uncertain, but the effect is clear. When he returned to Athens and founded his school around 387, he was no longer simply Socrates' student. He had his own vision, his own philosophy. He established the academy in a grove sacred to the hero Academus, just outside the city walls. It was not the first school in Athens, but it would become the most influential, lasting for over 900 years until a Christian emperor finally closed it. Students came from all over the Greek world. They studied mathematics, astronomy, philosophy. Above the entrance, an inscription supposedly read, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter." Plato never married. He had no children. His students became his family, the academy his life. He wrote, producing dialogues that featured Socrates as the main character, conducting the same kinds of conversations Plato had witnessed years before. But these were not mere transcripts. They were artistic creations, philosophical dramas, a new form of literature that had never existed before. Socrates in the dialogue says things the historical Socrates probably never said, develops ideas that belong to Plato himself. But the method, the questioning, the relentless pursuit of truth through conversation, that came directly from the man who had changed Plato's life. He made one serious attempt to put his political ideas into practice. He traveled to Syracuse in Sicily 3 times, trying to educate its ruler Dionysius the Younger in philosophy, hoping to create the philosopher king he wrote about in his dialogues. Each time the effort failed, sometimes dangerously. On one journey, he was allegedly sold into slavery and had to be ransomed by friends. He returned to Athens and his school, accepting that ideas might be the only realm where his ideal city could exist. He died around 348 or 347, in his 80s, having spent the last 40 years of his life teaching and writing. His nephew Speusippus took over the academy. His student Aristotle, who had studied there for 20 years, left to pursue his own path. The dialogues survived, copied and recopied, read in every generation. The man who had once wanted to be a poet had instead created something more lasting than any poem. He had taken the life and death of Socrates and transformed it into a philosophy that would shape Western thought for over 2,000 years. Socrates wrote nothing. This fact stands at the center of everything Plato did. The man who shaped Western philosophy more than perhaps any other person before or since never put his ideas on papyrus or parchment. He spoke, he questioned, he lived his philosophy in the streets and marketplaces of Athens, and then he died. This created a problem. When Socrates was executed in 399, his ideas existed only in the memories of those who had known him. Several of his followers wrote what came to be called Socratic dialogues, trying to preserve his method and his thought. Plato was one of these, but he went further than the others. He did not just record what Socrates had said. He developed what Socrates had begun, using the character of his teacher as a vehicle for ideas that grew far beyond anything the historical man had likely imagined. The method itself was distinctive. Socrates did not lecture. He did not present theories or build systems. He asked questions. He would approach someone who had a reputation for knowledge, often someone who made their living claiming to teach wisdom, and he would ask them to define something. What is courage? What is piety? What is virtue? The person would give an answer, usually confident at first. Then Socrates would ask another question, pointing out a consequence or implication of the answer. Then another question, and another. The pattern repeated itself in conversation after conversation. The person who started out confident would become confused, then frustrated, then often angry. Their definition would fall apart under examination. They would try new definitions, which would also fail. Eventually, they would admit they did not actually know what they thought they knew. Socrates called this his service to the city, comparing himself to a gadfly that stings a sluggish horse into wakefulness, or to a midwife who helps others give birth to ideas. He claimed to know nothing himself. This was not false modesty. He genuinely believed that wisdom consisted in recognizing one's own ignorance. The oracle at Delphi had declared that no one was wiser than Socrates. He interpreted this to mean that while others were ignorant but thought they knew, he alone was aware of his ignorance. This awareness was his only advantage. His questions had a purpose beyond simply exposing ignorance. He believed that truth existed, that knowledge was possible, but that it could not be poured into someone's mind like water into a jar. It had to be drawn out through questioning, through examining assumptions, through following arguments wherever they led. The conversation partner had to do the work themselves. The questioner merely guided them, showing where their reasoning led to contradictions, helping them see what they already implicitly knew but had not yet articulated. This method shaped everything about Plato's writing. He did not write treatises presenting his own views directly. He wrote dialogues, dramatic conversations, often featuring Socrates questioning someone. The early dialogues probably stay closest to how the historical Socrates actually spoke. They typically end without reaching a definitive answer. Someone proposes a definition of courage or justice or friendship. Socrates questions it. The definition fails. And the dialogue concludes with the participants knowing they are ignorant, but not yet possessing knowledge. The later dialogues change. Socrates begins to propose positive theories. He talks about another realm of existence beyond the physical world. He develops elaborate metaphors about caves and divided lines and the sun. These ideas almost certainly belong to Plato, not to the historical Socrates. But Plato never appears in his own dialogues. He remains hidden behind the character of his teacher, speaking through Socrates even when developing ideas Socrates probably never held. Why write this way? Plato could have written philosophical treatises under his own name, as Aristotle later did. He could have presented his theories directly. Instead, he chose this indirect method, creating dramatic scenes, giving his characters personalities, sometimes humor, sometimes letting them contradict each other without clearly indicating which position he himself endorsed. One reason connects to what Socrates had taught him about how people actually learn. Reading a treatise is passive. The author presents conclusions, the reader absorbs them or does not. But working through a dialogue, following the questions, seeing where arguments lead, noticing the contradictions, this requires active participation. The reader has to think, to question, to do philosophy, rather than simply receive it. The form matches the method. Another reason appears in Plato's own critique of writing, which he places in Socrates' mouth in one of the dialogues. Writing seems to preserve knowledge, but it creates an illusion. Written words cannot answer questions. They cannot adapt to the particular person reading them. They say the same thing to everyone, whether the reader understands or not, whether the reader is ready for the ideas or not. Living conversation allows for this flexibility. The speaker can adjust to the listener, can probe to see if understanding has occurred, can approach the same idea from different angles if one approach fails. Yet Plato wrote anyway, and wrote extensively. This creates a paradox at the heart of his work. He used writing to criticize writing. He created fixed texts while believing that truth could only be approached through flexible dialogue. The explanation seems to be that he saw writing as a reminder, a way to spark the memory of those who had already discussed these ideas in person, not as a replacement for actual philosophical conversation. The dialogues were supplements to the teaching that happened in the academy, not standalone presentations of doctrine. The influence of Socrates appears not just in method, but in content. The historical Socrates focused on ethical questions. How should one live? What is virtue? Is it better to suffer injustice or commit it? He believed that virtue was knowledge, that no one does wrong willingly, that if people truly understood what was good, they would do it. These ideas permeate Plato's work even in the dialogues where other concerns dominate. Socrates also believed in following the argument wherever it leads, regardless of convention or popularity. When the Athenian assembly wanted to execute 6 generals after a naval battle without proper trial, Socrates was serving on the committee that day and cast the only vote against the illegal procedure. Under the 30 tyrants, when ordered to participate in an unjust arrest, he simply refused, risking his own life. At his trial, when he could have escaped death by proposing exile or making apologies, he instead defended his way of life and accepted the sentence. This absolute commitment to truth and justice over safety or convenience became the model for the philosophical life as Plato understood it. The true philosopher does not seek power or wealth or popularity. The true philosopher seeks knowledge of what is good and lives according to that knowledge regardless of consequences. Socrates drinking the hemlock became the ultimate image of this ideal, the philosopher who chose death over betraying his principles. Plato took this image and built an entire system of thought around it. He asked why Socrates had been right to die rather than compromise. What made justice and truth more important than life itself? The answer could not be found in the physical world where life seems to be the highest value. It had to exist in some other realm, some permanent reality of which this world was only a shadow. From Socrates' example and Socrates' method, Plato developed a metaphysics, an epistemology, a political philosophy. But he never claimed these as his own. He hid behind his teacher's name, making Socrates the spokesman for ideas that went far beyond anything Socrates had said. Whether this was humility or a deeper strategy remains unclear. Perhaps Plato genuinely could not separate his own thinking from what he had learned sitting in the marketplace listening to the man with the ugly face and the beautiful soul who turned every conversation into a search for truth. Consider a simple question. You see a beautiful sunset, a beautiful painting, a beautiful person. What makes all these things beautiful? They look completely different from each other. One is atmospheric light, one is paint on canvas, one is a living human being, yet you recognize beauty in all of them. How? You might say they share certain qualities, harmony, proportion, pleasing colors. But this just moves the question back one step. How do you know what harmony is? How do you recognize proportion when you see it? You have never seen harmony itself, only things that are harmonious. You have never encountered proportion in isolation, only objects that possess it. Yet somehow you can identify these qualities in wildly different contexts. Or take a simpler case. You see many individual horses. Some are brown, some black, some white, some are large, some small, some are healthy and strong, some old and weak. They all look different from each other, yet you instantly recognize each one as a horse. What are you actually recognizing? What is it that all horses share that makes them horses and not dogs or cows? The obvious answer is that they share certain physical characteristics. 4 legs, a particular body shape, hooves, a mane. But examine this more carefully. No 2 horses have exactly the same shape. Their legs are different lengths, their bodies different sizes. If you tried to define horse by listing every specific physical measurement, you would end up with a definition that fit only one individual horse. Yet you can recognize an animal you have never seen before as a horse immediately. Something similar happens with concepts that have no physical form at all. Everyone uses the word justice. People argue about what is just or unjust. But what is justice itself? You can point to examples of just actions, keeping a promise, giving people what they deserve, treating equals equally. But what makes all these different actions just? What is the thing they share? You cannot point to it. You cannot see it or touch it. Justice does not exist in the physical world as a thing you can examine. Yet you recognize it, or fail to recognize it, in particular situations. You make judgments about whether an action is just or unjust. You must be comparing the action to something, to some standard. But what is that standard and where does it come from? This is where Plato begins. He observes that we recognize qualities in things. We group things into categories. We make judgments about whether things are beautiful or ugly, just or unjust, good or bad. We do this constantly, automatically. But the qualities themselves are not physical objects. The categories are not visible things. The standards by which we judge are not written down anywhere for us to consult. Yet we all do this, and remarkably, we largely agree with each other. Not perfectly, not always, but enough that communication is possible. When you say horse, others know what you mean, even though they have never seen the same individual horses you have seen. When you say something is unjust, others understand what kind of criticism you are making, even if they disagree with your particular judgment. Plato's answer is that there must be something real that corresponds to these qualities and categories and standards. Not real in the sense of being a physical object you can touch, but real in the sense of actually existing, of being something rather than nothing. He calls these realities forms or ideas. There is the form of beauty, the form of horse, the form of justice. These are not just concepts in our minds. They are real existences, more real in fact than the physical things we see around us. Physical things change constantly. The beautiful sunset fades. The painting's colors deteriorate over time. The beautiful person ages and dies. The individual horse grows old and eventually ceases to exist. Everything in the physical world is in flux, coming into being and passing away, never remaining the same from one moment to the next. You cannot step into the same river twice because the water has flowed on. You cannot see the same person twice because cells have died and been replaced, because the body has changed, however slightly. But beauty itself does not change. The form of horse does not grow old and die. Justice remains what it is regardless of whether any particular action is just or unjust. These forms are eternal, unchanging, perfect. They simply are. They exist beyond time, beyond space, beyond the physical world entirely. The physical things we see are related to the forms but are not the same as them. A particular beautiful object participates in beauty or resembles it or is patterned after it. Different dialogues use different language for this relationship, but the basic idea remains constant. The physical object has beauty because it shares in some way in the form of beauty. But it is not itself beauty. It is a copy, an imitation, an imperfect reflection. This is why physical things are always imperfect. This particular horse has some defect, some way in which it falls short of being a perfect horse. This particular circle drawn on paper is never exactly circular. If you examine it closely enough, you find irregularities, but you recognize it as a circle because it resembles the form of circle, the perfect circle that exists, not on paper, but in that other realm of unchanging reality. The forms are not just templates for physical objects. They also serve as standards for judgment. When you say an action is unjust, you are comparing it to the form of justice and finding it lacking. When you call something beautiful, you are recognizing in it some resemblance to beauty itself. The forms are what make knowledge possible because they provide something stable to know. You cannot have real knowledge of things that constantly change. You can only have opinions about them, beliefs that might be true at one moment but false the next. Knowledge requires an object that remains the same, that can be grasped by the mind and understood fully. This creates a picture of two different realms of existence. There is the visible world, the realm of physical objects and bodies, of change and impermanence and imperfection. This is the world we live in, the world our senses show us. Then there is the intelligible world, the realm of the forms, eternal and changeless and perfect. This is the world we grasp with our minds, the world we access through reason and thought, rather than through sight and touch. Most people live their entire lives focused entirely on the visible world. They see the shadows and reflections and copies and mistake them for reality. They pursue beauty without understanding what beauty is. They try to act justly without knowing justice itself. Their lives are spent chasing things that change and fade and die, never grasping the permanent realities that lie behind appearances. The philosopher is someone who turns away from this confusion and directs their attention toward the forms. Not physically turning, because the forms are not located in physical space. But intellectually, through reason and reflection, the philosopher comes to understand that the true object of knowledge is not the particular things, but the universal forms they imperfectly reflect. The philosopher seeks to know beauty itself, justice itself, goodness itself. This is difficult. It requires training in mathematics and logic, because these disciplines teach the mind to work with abstract realities rather than physical objects. It requires freeing oneself from the deceptions of the senses, which constantly tell us that the physical world is all there is. It requires, above all, the recognition that what seems most real, most solid, most obvious to our everyday experience is actually the least real, the most changeable, the most deceptive. Imagine an architect designing a building before any stone is laid or timber cut. The building exists in the architect's mind as a plan, a blueprint. The physical building that eventually gets constructed is an attempt to realize that plan in matter. Sometimes the construction succeeds well, closely matching the design. Sometimes it fails, producing something that barely resembles what was intended. But the plan exists first, and the building is judged by how well it matches the plan. For Plato, this relationship between plan and physical building reflects the relationship between the forms and physical objects. Except the forms are not in anyone's mind, they are not created by thought. They exist independently, eternally. They are the blueprints not for human constructions but for everything that exists in the physical world. The form of horse is something like the perfect blueprint for all possible horses. Every individual horse that exists is an attempt, in a sense, to embody that form in matter. Some come closer than others. A healthy, well-proportioned horse resembles the form more closely than a sick, deformed one. But no physical horse can ever perfectly match the form, because matter itself imposes limitations. Physical things decay, change, die. The form remains perfect and eternal. This applies to everything. There is a form of tree, of mountain, of river. There are forms for human-made things as well. The form of bed exists, and every bed a carpenter makes is an attempt to embody that form in wood and nails. There are forms for qualities: largeness, smallness, hardness, softness. There are forms for mathematical objects: circle, triangle, the number 3. And there are forms for values: beauty, justice, courage, wisdom, and above all others, goodness. The forms exist in a kind of hierarchy. Some are more fundamental than others. The form of goodness stands at the top, the highest and most important of all forms. It is to the intelligible world what the sun is to the visible world. Just as the sun makes physical things visible and allows them to exist and grow, the form of goodness makes the other forms intelligible and in some sense gives them their being. To understand anything fully, you must understand it in relation to the good. This is not the good as in morally good, at least not initially. It is more like perfect, complete, functioning as it should. A good knife cuts well, a good horse runs fast and carries burdens effectively. The good itself is the principle of perfection, of fulfillment, of being fully what something is meant to be. Everything else derives whatever goodness it has from participating in this ultimate form. The physical world relates to this realm of forms in a specific way. Physical objects are like shadows cast by the forms, or reflections in water, or paintings copied from an original. They derive whatever reality they possess from the forms. A physical horse exists only because the form of horse exists. It is a horse because it participates in or imitates that form. Without the form, there would be no way for matter to organize itself into the shape and nature of a horse. This means the forms are more real than physical objects. This seems backwards to common sense. The horse you can see and touch seems obviously more real than some abstract form you can only think about. But Plato argues that reality is not about being tangible. It is about being permanent, unchanging, independently existing. The physical horse depends on the form to be what it is. The form depends on nothing. It simply exists, always has existed, always will exist. That makes it more real, not less. Physical objects are caught between being and non-being. They exist, but imperfectly, temporarily. A horse exists now but did not exist a few years ago and will not exist in another few years. While it exists, it is constantly changing, constantly becoming different from what it was. At what point is it fully real? At birth? At maturity? It is never exactly the same for 2 consecutive moments. In this sense, physical things are always becoming, never fully being. The forms simply are, they do not become. Horse exists fully, completely, eternally. It is not old or young, sick or healthy, alive or dead. These are characteristics of physical horses, not of the form itself. The form is pure being, pure reality, pure existence without qualification or limitation. This is why knowledge of the physical world is impossible in the strictest sense. You cannot know something that is constantly changing. By the time you have formed a judgment about it, it has already become something slightly different. You can have opinions about physical things. Some opinions are better than others, more accurate based on more careful observation. But true knowledge, certain knowledge, unchanging knowledge can only be of things that do not change. It can only be of the forms. Mathematics provides the clearest example of this kind of knowledge. When you prove something about triangles, you are not proving it about any physical triangle. Every triangle you could draw or build in the physical world is imperfect. The lines have thickness, the angles are slightly off, the figure exists on a surface that is not perfectly flat. But you can prove things about the triangle itself, the perfect form, and these proofs are certain, eternal, unchanging. What is true about triangles was true before any human thought about them and will remain true after humanity is gone. The same applies to moral and aesthetic knowledge. Justice itself can be known, even though every example of justice in the physical world is imperfect. When you understand what justice is, really understand it by grasping the form, then you have knowledge that no experience can overturn. Your knowledge is not based on having seen many examples of just actions. It is based on having understood the form that all just actions imperfectly reflect. This creates a strange situation. The world you live in, the world you see and touch and navigate every day, is not the real world. It is a world of images and copies and shadows. The real world is invisible, accessible only to thought, eternal and unchanging. Everything around you is derivative, secondary, dependent. The true reality lies beyond all perception, beyond all physical experience, in a realm you can only reach through reason. Most people never make this journey. They spend their lives thinking that the shadows are the only reality. They organize their lives around physical pleasures and pains, around acquiring things that will decay, around pursuing goals in a world that is constantly slipping away from them. They are like people living in a dream, taking the dream for reality, never waking up to see the true world. The philosopher is someone who wakes up, not physically, but intellectually. Through education, through training in mathematics and logic, through dialectic or reasoned argument, the philosopher comes to understand that the physical world is not the only world or the primary world. There is another realm, more real, more perfect, more deserving of attention and study. The philosopher learns to look past appearances to the reality behind them, to see the form shining through the imperfect physical copy. This shift in attention is not easy. It goes against every habit formed by living in a body with senses. The senses constantly insist that the physical world is real, that what you see and touch is what actually exists. Training the mind to recognize that the senses deceive, that true reality is invisible, requires enormous effort. It requires, in a sense, learning to live backwards, valuing what most people ignore and ignoring what most people value. But once achieved, this understanding changes everything. The person who has grasped the forms sees the physical world differently. Physical beauty becomes a pointer toward beauty itself. Physical instances of justice become imperfect reflections of true justice. The philosopher no longer mistakes the copy for the original, the shadow for the reality. Life in the physical world continues, but it is now understood in relation to a higher realm, judged by higher standards, oriented toward eternal truths rather than temporary pleasures. This is the foundation of everything else Plato builds. His views on knowledge, on education, on politics, on art, on the soul, all rest on this basic distinction between the changing physical world and the eternal realm of forms. Once you understand that there are two worlds and that the invisible one is more real than the visible one, everything else follows. Deep underground, a group of people sit chained in place. They have been there since childhood, legs and necks bound so they cannot turn their heads. All they can see is the wall in front of them. Behind them burns a fire. Between the fire and the prisoners runs a raised walkway, and along this walkway people carry objects, statues of animals and humans and other things. The fire casts shadows of these objects on the wall the prisoners face. The prisoners watch these shadows their entire lives. They give the shadows names. When a shadow of a person appears, they call it a person. When they see the shadow of a horse, they call it a horse. They discuss the shadows, argue about them, develop expertise in predicting which shadow will appear next. The shadows are their entire reality. They know nothing else. One prisoner is freed, the chains are removed, he can turn his head. This is painful after a lifetime of being held in one position. He looks around and sees the fire. The light hurts his eyes. He is confused. Someone tells him that what he saw his whole life were merely shadows, that the real objects are here, carried along the walkway. He does not believe this. The shadows seem more real to him than these strange objects. He wants to go back to watching the wall, but he is forced up out of the cave entirely. The path is steep and rough. He is dragged along against his will, up through a long passageway, until finally he emerges into the sunlight. The sun is blindingly painful. He cannot see anything at first. His eyes, accustomed to darkness and the dim firelight, cannot handle this brightness. He is miserable. He wants to return to the cave where at least he could see. Gradually his eyes adjust. At first he can only look at shadows and reflections. He sees the shadows of trees, the reflections of things in water. These he can bear to look at. Slowly he progresses to seeing the actual objects, trees, rocks, animals, people. Finally he can look at the sun itself, not reflections of it in water, but the actual sun in the sky. He understands that this is what provides light for everything else. What makes seeing possible at all? What creates the seasons and years and governs everything in the visible world? Now he remembers the cave. He thinks about his former life, about what passed for wisdom there, about the other prisoners still chained and staring at shadows. He feels sorry for them. He has no desire for the honors and prizes they give each other for being quickest to spot which shadow will appear next. These things seem ridiculous to him now. He would rather be anything, would rather suffer any hardship, than go back to living the way he had lived, taking shadows for reality. But he does go back. He descends into the cave again. When he enters, his eyes are now accustomed to the sunlight. The cave seems pitch dark to him. He cannot see at all. He stumbles around, unable to make out even the shadows on the wall. The prisoners who never left laugh at him. Look what happened to him when he went up there, they say. He went away and came back with his eyes ruined. The journey is not even worth attempting, and if anyone tries to free them, to drag them out as he was dragged out, they will kill that person if they can. This is Plato's image of the human condition. The cave is the physical world, the realm of visible things. The prisoners are ordinary people who take physical reality to be the only reality. The shadows on the wall are the physical objects they see around them, which are themselves merely images of the forms. The fire represents the sun in the physical world, which makes physical objects visible. The objects carried along the walkway represent the forms themselves. The journey out of the cave is education, the process of turning the soul away from the physical world toward the realm of forms. The sun outside represents the form of the good, which illuminates all other forms and makes knowledge possible. The image captures several things at once. First, the difficulty of learning. The prisoner does not want to be freed. When freed, he finds the process painful. His first glimpse of reality hurts. He would rather return to what is familiar, even though it is false. Education is not a matter of putting knowledge into an empty mind. It is a matter of turning the whole person around, redirecting their attention from one kind of reality to another. This is painful and difficult. No one does it willingly at first. Second, the nature of ignorance. The prisoners are not stupid. They are good at what they do. They have expertise in tracking and predicting shadows. In the cave, they are the wise ones, the ones others respect and honor. But their expertise is worthless because it is based on a fundamental error about what is real. They have sharp vision, but it is pointed in the wrong direction. True education is not about sharpening vision, but about turning it toward the right objects. Third, the isolation of the philosopher. The person who has left the cave cannot communicate with those still inside. They live in different worlds. What the freed person has seen, the prisoners cannot imagine. The freed person's inability to see shadows as clearly as before looks like damage, like intellectual failure. The prisoners have no framework for understanding that there might be a reality beyond what they see, that the shadows are not the whole story. The philosopher appears foolish by the cave's standards. Fourth, the resistance to enlightenment. The prisoners will kill anyone who tries to free them. They are not neutral about their condition. They actively defend their illusions. This is not a theoretical point for Plato. Athens killed Socrates for trying to make people question their assumptions, for trying to turn them away from conventional opinions toward examined truth. The city treated the philosopher as a threat, as someone corrupting and misleading people, when in fact he was trying to free them. The journey out of the cave proceeds in stages. You cannot go directly from seeing shadows to looking at the sun. The eyes must adjust gradually. First shadows and reflections of real things, then the things themselves, then celestial objects, finally the sun. Each stage prepares for the next. Education must follow this same progression. You begin with familiar things, with mathematics and logic that train the mind to work with abstract objects. You move to dialectic, to the examination of assumptions and the pursuit of first principles. Eventually, if the education succeeds, you grasp the form of the good itself, the source of all reality and all knowledge. The freed prisoner has an obligation to return. He would prefer to stay outside, to spend his time contemplating the sun and the real objects. But he must go back down into the cave. Those still trapped there are his people, his fellow citizens. He has a duty to try to free them, even though they will resist, even though they may kill him for it. This is why philosophers must rule in the ideal city. They are the only ones who have seen true reality, who understand what is genuinely good rather than what merely appears good. But they must be compelled to rule, because they would rather remain focused on the forms than deal with the messy business of governing people who live in ignorance. The image also reveals something about the human condition that goes beyond politics. Everyone lives in some version of the cave. Everyone mistakes appearances for reality in some domain of their life. Everyone resists having their comfortable illusions challenged. The specific content of the illusions differs from person to person, but the structure is the same. We see shadows and call them real. We become expert at analyzing these shadows. We honor those who are best at shadow watching. And when someone suggests that there is a reality beyond the shadows, we think they are crazy. Breaking out of this requires help. The prisoner is freed by someone else. He is dragged out against his will. Education is not something you do alone. It requires a teacher, someone who has already made the journey, who can guide you through the painful process of adjusting to the light. This is why Plato founded the academy, why he spent his life teaching. You cannot hand someone a book and expect them to escape the cave. You need living conversation, someone to answer questions, to address objections, to encourage you when you want to give up and return to familiar darkness. The cave image also suggests that our natural state is one of imprisonment. We are not born free and then enslaved. We are born into chains, born seeing shadows, born taking illusion for reality. Freedom is not the default condition. It must be achieved through effort, through education, through a complete reorientation of the soul. Most people never achieve it. They live and die in the cave, never suspecting that there is anything beyond the shadows on the wall. But the possibility exists. The chains can be broken. The journey can be made. This is what separates humans from other animals. Animals see the physical world and nothing more. They have no capacity to grasp the forms, to understand that there is a reality beyond appearances. Humans have that capacity. Most never use it, but it is there, waiting. The philosophical life is the life of someone who has activated that capacity, who has made the journey from darkness to light, from opinion to knowledge, from the cave of illusions to the sunlit reality beyond. A child sees a tree for the first time and somehow knows it is a tree. Not that particular tree with that specific arrangement of branches, but tree as a category, as a type of thing. No one sat down and explained to the child what makes something a tree rather than a bush or a flower. The child simply recognizes it. This happens constantly with everything we know. We recognize things, grasp concepts, understand relationships without being explicitly taught most of them. How is this possible? The standard answer is experience. We learn from what we see and hear. We observe many examples and extract patterns from them. A child sees multiple trees, notices what they have in common, forms a concept of treeness. But this explanation creates a problem. To notice what multiple things have in common, you must already have some idea of what you are looking for. To group these particular plants together as trees, rather than grouping them with grass or clouds or anything else, you must already possess some criterion for grouping. Where does that criterion come from? Plato's answer is that we do not learn these things from experience at all. We remember them. Before birth, the soul existed in the realm of forms. There it directly perceived beauty, justice, equality, treeness, everything that exists as a form. The soul had pure knowledge, perfect understanding. Then it was born into a body. The trauma of birth caused it to forget everything it knew, but the knowledge is still there, buried in the soul, waiting to be recovered. What we call learning is actually remembering. When you see a beautiful thing and recognize it as beautiful, you are not learning about beauty from the object. The object is imperfect, and from the imperfect you cannot derive knowledge of the perfect. Instead, the sight of the beautiful object triggers a memory. Your soul recalls the form of beauty it once knew directly. The physical beauty reminds you of the real beauty you have forgotten. This explains why we can recognize things we have never encountered before. We have not seen every possible horse, yet we can identify a horse we have never seen as a horse. We are not comparing it to our memory of other horses. We are comparing it to our soul's memory of the form of horse, which we knew before birth. The physical horse matches that buried memory closely enough to trigger recognition. Mathematics provides the strongest evidence for this theory. No one teaches a child that 2 + 2 = 4 by showing them 4 physical objects. Physical objects are never perfect units. This rock is larger than that rock. This apple is riper than that apple. You cannot actually demonstrate pure numerical relationships using imperfect physical things. Yet children grasp mathematical truths easily, often figuring them out before being taught. This is why Plato insisted on mathematical training for philosophers, and why the academy supposedly bore the inscription, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter." Mathematics is the bridge between the physical and the eternal. When you work with numbers and geometric forms, you are working with entities that exist nowhere in physical space but are more real than any physical thing. The number 3 is not a physical object. You cannot touch it or see it. Yet it is perfectly real, more permanent than any physical 3 objects you could point to. Mathematical truths are eternal and necessary. 2 plus 2 equaled 4 a billion years before humans existed. It will still equal 4 when the sun burns out. This truth does not depend on human minds or physical reality. It simply is. And yet humans can know it with absolute certainty. How? Because our souls, being immaterial like the forms, can grasp immaterial realities. Mathematics proves that non-physical knowledge is possible, that reason can access truths independent of sense experience. Geometric knowledge is even more striking. No one has ever seen a perfect circle. Every circle you could draw or construct has flaws. The line has thickness. The curve has slight irregularities. Yet when someone proves something about circles using geometry, everyone understands that the proof is about the perfect circle, not about the imperfect drawing used to illustrate it. Where does knowledge of the perfect circle come from if not from memory of the form? The same applies to moral concepts. Everyone has some notion of justice, even young children. They complain when something is unfair, when they are treated unjustly. They did not learn this from examples, because all examples of justice in the world are imperfect and disputable. What one person calls just another calls unjust. From these conflicting examples, how could anyone extract a clear concept of what justice actually is? The concept must come from elsewhere, from a source of perfect knowledge that precedes experience. This theory of knowledge as recollection means that teaching is not filling an empty vessel. The teacher does not pour knowledge into the student. The teacher helps the student remember what they already know but have forgotten. This is why Socrates called himself a midwife. He helped people give birth to ideas that were already in them, already in their souls, waiting to emerge. The method of questioning serves this purpose. When Socrates asked someone to define justice, he was not looking for them to describe examples they had observed. He was trying to make them reach inside themselves, to access the knowledge their soul possessed. The questions stripped away false opinions based on imperfect examples, clearing the way for true knowledge to surface from memory. Education, then, is recollection. The purpose of studying mathematics is not to learn something new, but to remember eternal truths the soul once knew. The purpose of dialectic, of philosophical conversation, is to remember the forms themselves. The whole project of philosophy is a project of remembering, of recovering lost knowledge, of waking up the soul to what it always already knew. This has implications for what knowledge actually is. Knowledge cannot be simply true belief. You might believe something true by accident, by lucky guess, without understanding why it is true. That is not knowledge. Knowledge requires understanding, requires grasping the reason why something is true, requires connecting it to the permanent realities that make it true. Knowledge is of the forms, not of physical things. You can have true beliefs about physical things. You can correctly believe that this particular action is just, or that particular object is beautiful. But these are opinions, not knowledge, because they are about things that change. True knowledge is knowing justice itself, beauty itself. And this knowledge comes not from observation, but from recollection, from the soul remembering what it perceived before birth. This creates a hierarchy of cognitive states. At the bottom is imagination or illusion, taking shadows and reflections for real things. Next is belief or opinion, accepting physical objects as real but not understanding the forms they reflect. Higher is mathematical thinking, working with abstractions but still using physical diagrams and examples as aids. Highest is pure understanding, grasping the forms themselves through reason alone without any reliance on physical examples. Most people never rise above opinion. They form beliefs about the world based on what they see, and if their beliefs happen to be true, they think they have knowledge. But they are like people with correct opinions about which road to take without understanding why that road leads to the destination. They might arrive, but they do not know the way. True knowledge requires understanding, requires grasping the principles, requires seeing how things connect to the forms. The soul's ability to remember depends on its nature. The soul is not physical. It does not have size or shape or location. It belongs to the realm of the forms, not the realm of physical objects. This is why it could exist before birth and why it can know the forms. Physical senses cannot perceive non-physical realities. Eyes see colors, ears hear sounds, but these senses cannot grasp beauty itself or justice itself. Only the soul, through reason, can access these realities. The soul's knowledge is not created by experience. Experience only triggers memory. A person raised in complete isolation, never seeing anything beautiful, would still have the concept of beauty in their soul. They might not activate it, might not remember it without some trigger, but it would be there. This is why people from completely different cultures can discuss beauty or justice and understand each other. They are not creating these concepts from their different experiences. They are all remembering the same forms their souls knew before birth. This theory explains why some people learn faster than others. It is not that some people are smarter in the sense of having better brains. It is that some souls remember more easily. The knowledge is there in everyone, but the barriers to remembering differ. Some people's souls are less clouded by the body and its concerns, more able to turn inward and access buried memories. Education helps everyone remember, but it works more quickly with those whose souls are naturally closer to the surface. It also explains the experience of suddenly understanding something you have been struggling with. You work on a problem, make no progress, then suddenly the answer appears. It feels like it comes from nowhere, like a light turning on. This is the moment of recollection, when the soul finally remembers what it knew all along. The struggle was not to create new knowledge, but to clear away the obstacles blocking access to existing knowledge. The theory has a strange consequence. Nothing you learn is actually new. Everything you come to know was already known by your soul before you were born. Discovery is rediscovery. Insight is memory. The entire intellectual life of a human being is the process of recovering what was lost at birth, of bringing back into consciousness what the soul knew perfectly before it became trapped in a body. This makes the body an obstacle to knowledge rather than an aid. The senses mislead. They show you imperfect copies and tempt you to think these are real. The body's needs and desires distract the soul from its proper work of recollection. Hunger, thirst, sexual desire, physical pain and pleasure, all these pull the soul's attention toward the physical world and away from the forms. To know anything truly, the soul must turn away from the body as much as possible, must practice a kind of death while still alive. Philosophy becomes preparation for dying, not in a morbid sense, but in the sense that the philosopher trains to separate the soul from bodily concerns, to live as purely intellectually as possible while still trapped in flesh. Death, when it comes, simply completes this separation. The soul is freed from the body entirely and can return to direct perception of the forms, can know again what it knew before birth without the interference of physical senses and bodily desires. But this raises a question. If the soul knew everything before birth, why did it enter a body at all? Why undergo this fall from perfect knowledge into forgetfulness? Plato's answer shifts across different dialogues, but the basic idea is that embodiment serves a purpose. The struggle to remember, the difficulty of turning away from illusion toward truth, strengthens the soul, a soul that has successfully practiced philosophy, that has remembered the forms despite the obstacles of embodiment, is better off than a soul that simply remained in the realm of forms without ever being tested. The body is not just a prison, it is also a training ground. The soul chose to be born, chose to forget, in order to have the opportunity to remember through its own effort. This makes education deeply important. The soul's fate after death depends on what it has remembered, on how much it has turned away from the physical and back toward the forms. A soul that spent its life absorbed in bodily pleasures, never attempting to remember, never practicing philosophy, remains trapped in ignorance even after the body dies. A soul that successfully recollected, that grasped the forms once again, returns to the realm of forms with something it did not have before, the achievement of having recovered truth despite obstacles. Knowledge, then, is not information. It is a state of the soul, a condition of being oriented toward the right objects, of having remembered what matters. You cannot acquire it by reading books or listening to lectures, though these can help trigger memory. You acquire it by turning your soul, by practicing the kind of thinking that accesses buried memories, by living in a way that prioritizes the eternal over the temporary. Inside every person, 3 different drives compete for control. Think of a chariot pulled by 2 horses with a driver holding the reins. The driver represents reason, the part of you that thinks, plans, understands. One horse is noble, well-bred, spirited. It responds to commands, wants to do what is right, seeks honor and victory. The other horse is wild, stubborn, difficult to control. It lunges toward whatever gives immediate pleasure, ignores commands, cares nothing for honor or shame, only for satisfying its appetites. This is not a metaphor Plato uses casually. It describes the actual structure of the soul. The soul is not a single unified thing. It has 3 distinct parts, 3 different sources of motivation and desire, often pulling in different directions. The rational part seeks truth and knowledge. The spirited part seeks honor, victory, recognition. The appetitive part seeks food, drink, sex, physical pleasure of all kinds. You can see these 3 parts in conflict constantly. You know you should study, but you want to sleep. Reason says study, appetite says sleep. Your spirited part might side with either depending on whether you care more about the honor of doing well or the immediate comfort of rest. Or you are insulted by someone and want to fight back, but reason tells you fighting will make things worse. Spirit wants to defend your honor, reason wants to avoid harm, appetite might not care either way unless physical safety is at stake. These are not three different opinions from the same part of the soul. They are three genuinely different parts, each with its own nature, its own concerns, its own way of seeing the world. The rational part can grasp the forms, can understand mathematics, can plan for the future. The spirited part feels shame and pride, anger at injustice, the desire to win. The appetitive part just wants pleasure now, immediate satisfaction with no thought for consequences or ideals. The parts can work together or fight each other. The best life is when reason rules, when the rational part commands and the other two parts obey. The spirited part should be reason's ally, enforcing its decisions, providing the courage and determination to follow through on what reason knows is best. The appetitive part should be controlled, given what it needs but not allowed to dominate, kept in check like a dangerous animal that must be fed but never set free. But achieving this harmony is difficult. The appetitive part is strong. It is connected directly to the body and its needs. Hunger, thirst, sexual desire, these are powerful forces that do not respond to rational argument. You cannot convince hunger to go away by explaining that eating right now would be unwise. The appetitive part does not understand reasons, it only understands satisfaction or frustration of its desires. The spirited part is more amenable to reason, but has its own dangers. It wants honor and recognition, wants to win, hates being shamed or defeated. This can lead someone to foolish actions in pursuit of glory, to violence when insulted, to caring more about what others think than about what is actually good. An overdeveloped spirited part creates someone who is brave but rash, proud but arrogant, concerned with reputation more than truth. The rational part is naturally weakest. It has no connection to physical force, no immediate power over the body. It can only persuade, only guide, only try to control the other parts through wisdom rather than strength. In most people, reason loses most of the time. Appetite drives them toward pleasure regardless of consequences. Spirit drives them toward conflicts that reason knows they should avoid. Reason protests but cannot enforce its will. Education aims to strengthen the rational part and train the spirited part to serve it. Mathematics and philosophy develop reason, teaching it to grasp eternal truths and make sound judgments. Physical training and music develop spirit, channeling its energy toward noble pursuits rather than petty pride. Appetite must be controlled through discipline, given enough to keep the body healthy, but not so much that it grows dominant. The three parts explain why people can be genuinely conflicted. You are not of two minds about something. You are of three minds, each part wanting something different, each pulling in its own direction. The recovering alcoholic who simultaneously wants to drink and wants to stay sober is experiencing the appetitive part demanding alcohol, while the rational part knows this will lead to ruin. The spirited part might side with either, feeling pride in resisting temptation or shame at being weak. This three-part structure also explains how different people develop such different characters. If appetite dominates, you get someone who lives for pleasure, who makes every decision based on immediate gratification, who cannot delay satisfaction or sacrifice comfort for any greater good. If spirit dominates, you get someone who is competitive, aggressive, obsessed with status and reputation, brave in battle but perhaps foolish in peace. If reason dominates, you get the philosopher, someone who values truth above pleasure or honor, who lives by principle rather than desire. Most people are mixtures. Appetite dominates in some areas, spirit in others, reason occasionally gets the upper hand, but pure types exist. The purely appetitive person is like an animal, driven entirely by bodily needs and wants. The purely spirited person is like a warrior, living for glory and conquest. The purely rational person is the philosopher, caring nothing for pleasure or honor, seeking only truth and wisdom. These three parts do not develop at the same rate. Babies are almost pure appetite. They want food, comfort, sleep. They have no reason yet, no ability to understand or plan. Spirit develops next, the young child's pride and shame, desire to be praised and fear of punishment. Reason comes last, slowly emerging through education, often never fully developing at all. The parts are also located differently in the body, though not in a physical sense. Reason resides in the head, the seat of thought. Spirit resides in the chest, connected to the heart and breathing, the physical manifestations of courage and anger. Appetite resides in the belly and below, in the organs connected to digestion and reproduction. This is not anatomy, but a way of understanding how different drives connect to different physical experiences. The soul's health depends on proper relationships among these parts. A healthy soul is one where reason rules, spirit enforces, and appetite obeys. This is justice in the soul, each part doing its proper work, none overstepping its bounds. An unjust soul is one where the parts are disordered, where appetite commands or spirit rules or reason is ignored. This internal justice mirrors political justice. A just city is one where the rational guardians rule, the spirited warriors defend, and the productive class obeys. The city is the soul writ large, the same structure at a different scale. Understanding the soul helps understand the city, and vice versa. Both are systems with parts that must be properly ordered to function well. The three parts also have different relationships to the forms. Only reason can grasp them. Appetite knows nothing of beauty or justice, only of pleasant tastes and enjoyable sensations. Spirit can respond to noble ideals without fully understanding them, can feel drawn to what is fine and honorable without grasping why. But only reason can actually know the forms, can understand what makes something truly just or beautiful, can see beyond appearances to eternal realities. This means the parts have different kinds of desires. Appetite desires physical objects. It wants this food, that drink, this sexual partner. Spirit desires status and recognition. It wants to be honored, to win, to be seen as courageous or strong. Reason desires truth. It wants to know, to understand, to grasp the forms themselves. These desires cannot all be satisfied simultaneously. Often they conflict directly. The goal of philosophy is not to eliminate the lower parts. That is impossible and undesirable. The body needs food and rest. Spirit provides necessary courage and motivation. The goal is to order the parts correctly, to make reason the ruler and bring the others into harmony with it. A well-ordered soul is not one where appetite has been killed, but one where appetite accepts the guidance of reason, taking pleasure in what is truly good rather than in whatever seems pleasant at the moment. This ordering is difficult because the parts speak different languages. Reason speaks in arguments and proofs. Spirit speaks in feelings of pride and shame. Appetite speaks in raw desire and satisfaction. Getting them to communicate, getting reason to control parts that do not understand rational argument, requires more than just thinking clearly. It requires training, habituation, the development of character over time. The chariot image captures this perfectly. The driver cannot abandon the horses. The chariot must be pulled by them. But if the horses run wild in different directions, the chariot crashes. The driver must control them, must use the reins, must train them to respond to commands. The noble horse is easier to train. The wild horse requires constant vigilance, sometimes harsh correction. But both must be brought under control if the chariot is to reach its destination. That destination is the good life, the life lived according to reason, oriented toward truth, achieving the harmony that makes happiness possible. Not the happiness of satisfied appetites, which is fleeting and ultimately empty. Not the happiness of honor and victory, which depends on others and circumstances beyond control, but the happiness of a well-ordered soul functioning as it should, each part doing its work, the whole person unified in pursuit of what is genuinely valuable. A young person sees someone beautiful and feels desire. This is where most people stop, where most understanding of love remains stuck. They want physical contact with the beautiful body, want to possess it, enjoy it. This desire seems simple, straightforward, entirely about that particular person and their physical form. But something more is happening, something most people never recognize. The desire is not really for that specific body, it is for beauty itself. The soul once knew beauty directly, before birth, when it existed in the realm of forms. The sight of a beautiful body triggers memory of that perfect beauty. The soul recognizes something in the physical person that reminds it of what it has lost. The desire that seems to be for physical contact is actually the soul trying to reconnect with the form of beauty it once knew. Most people misunderstand their own desire. They think they want this person, this body, this face and form. So they pursue physical intimacy. Perhaps they achieve it. And almost immediately the desire shifts or fades or becomes complicated. The beautiful person is still beautiful, the body unchanged, yet something is missing. What they really wanted was not there in the physical form after all. But they do not understand this. They think perhaps they chose the wrong person, or that desire naturally fades, or they need variety. They move to another beautiful body, and the cycle repeats. The wise person recognizes what is actually happening. The beautiful body is a pointer, a reminder, a step on a ladder that leads somewhere else. Physical beauty is the lowest rung. It is where the ascent begins, but it is not the destination. The person who stops at physical beauty has barely started the journey. The next step is recognizing that the beauty in one body is the same beauty that appears in other bodies. What makes this person beautiful is not unique to them. It is a quality, something that can appear in many different physical forms. Once you see this, your desire shifts. You no longer fixate on one particular person. You appreciate beauty wherever it appears. This seems like a degradation of love, a movement from devotion to one person toward shallow attraction to many. But it is actually progress. You are beginning to separate beauty from specific physical objects, beginning to grasp it as something independent. The third step is realizing that beauty appears in souls as well as bodies, and that beauty of soul is more valuable than beauty of body. A beautiful character, a noble mind, wisdom and virtue, these possess beauty more fully than any physical form. The beautiful body ages and decays. The beautiful soul remains beautiful, even grows more beautiful with time. At this stage, desire shifts again. You want to be close to people with beautiful souls, want to learn from them, want to become like them. This is still love, still desire, but transformed. The fourth step is recognizing beauty in activities, in laws and institutions, in the way a city is organized, in customs and practices. A just law has beauty. A well-ordered society possesses beauty. This is further from physical form, more abstract, but still recognizable as beauty. Desire at this stage drives you toward creating beautiful institutions, toward making society better, toward producing laws and systems that embody beauty in the realm of human affairs. The fifth step is discovering beauty in knowledge itself. Mathematical proofs have beauty. Philosophical arguments have beauty. Understanding has beauty. At this stage, you desire knowledge for its own sake, not for any practical benefit, but because knowledge itself is beautiful. You want to learn, to understand, to grasp truths, because doing so satisfies the desire that first appeared as physical attraction to a beautiful body. The final step is perceiving beauty itself, the form of beauty, not as it appears in bodies or souls or activities or knowledge, but as it exists eternally, perfectly, unchangingly. This is what the soul actually wanted all along. Every previous stage was preparation, was training the soul to perceive at higher and higher levels, to separate beauty from specific beautiful things, to grasp it as an independent reality. The person who reaches this final stage understands what they have been seeking their whole life. The form of beauty is not beautiful in some respects and ugly in others, as physical things are. It is not beautiful at one time and ugly at another, as bodies are when they age. It is not beautiful in relation to some people and ugly in relation to others, as particular tastes and judgments shift. It is simply beautiful, purely, perfectly, eternally. It never changes, never fades, never disappoints. This is the ultimate object of desire. Everything else was a confused yearning for this. The person who has seen beauty itself does not lose the ability to appreciate beautiful bodies, or beautiful souls, or beautiful knowledge. But these are now understood correctly, as reflections of the real beauty, as steps on the ladder rather than the destination. Desire is fulfilled, not eliminated. The soul has found what it was looking for. This understanding transforms relationships between people. The love between two people who recognize this pattern is different from ordinary physical attraction. They see in each other not just bodies to enjoy, but reminders of beauty itself. They help each other climb the ladder. The sight of physical beauty in the other person leads both of them toward higher forms of beauty. Their relationship becomes philosophical, aimed at truth and wisdom, not just or even primarily at physical pleasure. This is what gets called platonic love, though the term has been misunderstood. It does not mean love without physical attraction. It means love that understands physical attraction correctly, that recognizes it as the first stage of something that should develop into much more. Physical intimacy is not rejected, but is seen as the beginning of a journey, not the journey's end. The latter also explains why desire can be so irrational, so overwhelming, so apparently disconnected from reason. It is not actually irrational. It is the soul recognizing something immensely important, something connected to its deepest nature and highest potential. But if you do not understand what you are actually recognizing, if you think your desire is only for this person's body, then yes, it seems irrational. Why would a rational person become obsessed with physical contact with another physical object? But if you understand that your desire is really for beauty itself, that this person's body is triggering your soul's memory of the most important reality there is, then the intensity makes sense. The tragedy is that most people never climb the ladder. They remain stuck on the first rung, pursuing beautiful bodies, achieving possession perhaps, and never understanding why this does not satisfy them. They think something is wrong with them, or with love, or with the specific person they chose. They do not realize that the desire they feel is pointing beyond the physical, is trying to lead them towards something higher, but they keep misinterpreting it as a desire for something lower. Education in love is possible. An older person who has climbed higher can guide a younger person up the ladder. This is not seduction. It is teaching someone to understand their own desires correctly, to follow them where they actually lead rather than misinterpreting them. The older person shows the younger that beauty appears in many bodies, not one. Shows them that souls can be beautiful, shows them beautiful activities, beautiful knowledge, and finally, if both are capable, leads them toward perception of beauty itself. This kind of education was central to Greek culture in Plato's time, though often corrupted into mere physical relationships between older and younger men. Plato is trying to recover the true purpose of such relationships, to show what they should be if rightly understood. The older person should not want the younger person's body. The older person should want to help the younger person's soul ascend toward beauty. The younger person should not seek physical pleasure from the older person, but wisdom, guidance in climbing the ladder. When both people in a relationship understand this, they become companions on a journey. Each helps the other remember. Each reminds the other of beauty when daily life threatens to obscure it. Their bond is not based on physical attraction that will fade, but on shared pursuit of something eternal. This kind of relationship can last a lifetime and beyond, because what draws them together does not change or decay. The ladder of love is also a ladder of knowledge. As you climb, you understand more. Physical beauty is easy to grasp, available to anyone with working eyes. Beauty of soul requires more discernment. Beauty in activities and institutions requires understanding of how societies function. Beauty in knowledge requires philosophical training. Beauty itself can only be grasped by someone whose soul has been thoroughly prepared, thoroughly turned away from the physical and toward the eternal. This means love and philosophy are connected. The erotic drive, properly understood, leads to philosophy. The desire that begins with physical attraction, if followed correctly, becomes desire for wisdom. The lover becomes the philosopher. Both are driven by the same fundamental desire, for beauty, for goodness, for truth. These are ultimately the same thing, different aspects of the same reality. The person who has climbed the ladder and perceived beauty itself is transformed. They no longer chase after beautiful things with the desperation of someone who has never found what they seek. They know what real beauty is, have seen it, understand how particular beautiful things relate to it. They can appreciate and enjoy beautiful things without confusion, without thinking these things are what they really want. They have found what they wanted. Everything else is just a pleasant reminder. Imagine trying to see a small piece of text from far away. You cannot make out the letters clearly. Then someone shows you the same text written much larger. Now you can read it easily. Once you understand the large version, the small version becomes readable too. This is how Plato approaches understanding the soul. The soul is small and hard to examine directly, but a city is large, visible, easier to analyze. And a city has the same structure as a soul, the same parts, the same relationships, just at a larger scale. A city needs different kinds of people to function. Someone must produce food, build houses, make clothing. These are the farmers, craftsmen, merchants, the productive class. They work with their hands, create physical goods, exchange them, keep the material foundation of the city running. Without them, everyone starves. But they have no interest in ruling, no capacity for it. They understand their crafts, but not politics or philosophy. They want comfortable lives, want to feed their families, want modest prosperity. The city also needs defenders. Other cities might attack. Internal criminals might threaten order. Someone must be willing to fight, must have courage, must value honor more than safety. These are the guardians, the warrior class. They train from youth in physical combat and in courage. They must be fierce toward enemies, but gentle toward their own people, like good dogs that attack strangers but are tame with family. They live differently from the productive class, communally, without private property, focused entirely on defending the city. But warriors cannot rule either. Courage is not wisdom. The ability to fight does not confer understanding of what is good for the city. Warriors might be too aggressive, might start wars that should be avoided, might prioritize military glory over genuine welfare. They need someone to guide them, to tell them when to fight and when to refrain, to make decisions that require wisdom rather than just courage. This is where the rulers come from. They are chosen from among the guardians, those who show not just courage but intelligence, who can be educated in philosophy, who can grasp the forms. They spend decades in training, mathematics first, to turn their minds toward abstract realities, then dialectic, learning to question assumptions and pursue truth through argument. Finally, if capable, they perceive the form of the good itself. Only then are they ready to rule. These three classes mirror the three parts of the soul. The productive class corresponds to appetite. They are concerned with physical needs and wants, with production and consumption, with material comfort. The guardian class corresponds to spirit. They value honor, courage, victory, the noble qualities that drive warriors. The ruler class corresponds to reason. They understand truth, grasp the forms, know what is genuinely good rather than what merely appears good. Justice in the city is each class doing its own work. The productive class produces, the guardians defend, the rulers rule. No class attempts to do another's job. The craftsman does not try to make military decisions. The warrior does not try to govern. The ruler does not abandon philosophy to pursue wealth. When each part performs its function and only its function, the city operates smoothly. This is political justice. Justice in the soul is identical in structure. The appetitive part pursues necessary physical pleasures, but does not attempt to control the person. The spirited part provides courage and determination, but accepts direction from reason. The rational part rules, making decisions based on knowledge of what is truly good. When these relationships hold, when each part does its work without overstepping, the soul is just. And the just soul is the happy soul, functioning as it should, achieving the harmony that makes genuine happiness possible. Injustice is disorder. In the city, it is when the productive class tries to rule, when warriors make policy, when rulers abandon philosophy for wealth. The result is chaos. People doing jobs they are not suited for, the city's resources misallocated, decisions made badly. In the soul, injustice is when appetite rules, when someone lives for pleasure, or when spirit dominates, when someone lives for honor and glory. Reason protests, but cannot control the other parts. The result is internal conflict, the person pulled in different directions, never achieving what they really want. The ideal city requires careful education of the guardians. They are taken young before bad habits form. They study music and poetry, but only works that present noble characters and good examples. They do not read stories of gods behaving badly or heroes acting shamefully. Such stories corrupt, teaching that injustice can be acceptable. They study mathematics to train their minds in abstract thinking. They undergo physical training to develop courage and endurance. They live communally, sharing everything, owning nothing privately. This communal life extends even to families. The guardians have no private marriages. Men and women are chosen for mating based on eugenic principles, trying to breed the best possible children. The children are raised communally, not knowing who their biological parents are. Everyone of the parent generation is mother or father to everyone of the child generation. This eliminates family loyalty as a competing interest. The guardian thinks only of the city's good, never of enriching their own children because they do not know which children are theirs. This seems harsh, even crazy, but Plato is serious. Private families create private interests. A ruler who wants to advantage their own children will make bad decisions for the city. The only way to ensure rulers act for the common good is to eliminate private interests entirely. Guardians and rulers own no property, have no private families, receive no payment beyond simple maintenance. They cannot be corrupted because there is nothing to corrupt them with. The productive class lives normally. They have private property, private families, pursue wealth within limits. They are not educated in philosophy because they do not need it, and most are not capable of it. They need only to be good at their crafts and obedient to the rulers. This is not oppression if the rulers are truly wise and truly seek the good of the whole city. The craftsman is better off being ruled by wisdom than trying to rule themselves or being ruled by fools. The city also requires careful control of culture. Poets and artists are dangerous because they create images, copies of copies, twice removed from truth. A painter paints a bed, which is a copy of a physical bed, which is itself a copy of the form of bed. The painting is 3 steps from reality. Worse, artists appeal to the appetitive and spirited parts of the soul, not to reason. They make you feel without making you think. They present bad characters as admirable, show gods and heroes behaving shamefully, encourage emotions that should be controlled. Therefore, poetry is banned except for hymns to gods and praises of good people. Drama is banned entirely. The guardians must not be exposed to false images of reality or bad examples of behavior. The productive class is less restricted because they are not being trained for philosophy, but even they should not have unlimited access to corrupting influences. This city will never exist in reality. Plato knows this. He is not presenting a practical political program for Athens or any other actual city. He is describing the ideal, the form of city if you like, the pattern that all real cities imperfectly reflect. Real cities are corrupted by private interests, by rulers who pursue wealth or glory, by warriors who seize power, by the masses who demand what they want rather than what is good for them. But understanding the ideal helps evaluate real cities. You can see how far they fall short, can diagnose what is wrong with them. A city where the productive class rules, where merchants and craftsmen make policy, will pursue wealth rather than goodness. A city where warriors rule will be aggressive, militaristic, will value courage over wisdom. A city where no class rules effectively will be chaotic, each faction fighting for power, nothing getting done well. Athens in Plato's time was a democracy. The masses ruled or thought they ruled. In practice, clever speakers manipulated them, demagogues who told people what they wanted to hear rather than what was true. Decisions were made by voting among people who had no expertise, no philosophical training, no knowledge of the forms. They voted based on appetite and spirit, based on what they wanted or what sounded noble, not based on reason and knowledge of what was genuinely good. This is why democracy killed Socrates. The masses felt threatened by someone who questioned their opinions, who showed they did not know what they thought they knew. They wanted comfortable illusions, and Socrates disrupted those. A democratic city will always tend toward injustice because it is ruled by the wrong part. It is a city where appetite dominates, where people vote for what they want rather than what they need, where rulers compete to offer the most pleasing promises rather than the best policies. The only good city is one ruled by philosophers, by people who know the forms, who have seen the good itself, who understand what is truly beneficial rather than what merely appears beneficial. But philosophers do not want to rule. They would rather spend their time contemplating the forms, pursuing knowledge, living the philosophical life. They must be compelled to rule, must be forced to descend back into the cave and govern those who still see only shadows. This is their obligation. They were educated by the city, trained at public expense to perceive the forms. They owe the city their service, and they are the only ones qualified to rule, not because they want power, which would disqualify them, but precisely because they do not want it, because they understand that ruling is a burden, a duty, not an opportunity for personal gain. The connection between city and soul is precise. Understanding one illuminates the other. A person ruled by appetite is like a city ruled by the productive class, devoted to wealth and pleasure, ignoring higher values. A person ruled by spirit is like a city ruled by warriors, pursuing honor and glory, brave but potentially foolish. A person ruled by reason is like a city ruled by philosophers, oriented toward truth, making decisions based on knowledge of what is genuinely good. The just person and the just city are both rare. Most people live unjustly, ruled by appetite or spirit or some chaotic mixture. Most cities are unjust, ruled by the wrong class or by no class effectively. But the ideal exists. It can be known through philosophy, and knowing it changes how you live, even if you cannot make the ideal real in the external world. You can at least make your own soul just. You can establish reason as ruler, train spirit to be its ally, control appetite to accept guidance. You can become internally what the ideal city is externally, a harmonious whole with each part performing its proper function. This internal justice is what actually matters. External political arrangements are important but secondary. The primary task is ordering your own soul correctly. This is why Plato spent his life teaching rather than trying to seize political power. He attempted to educate a ruler 3 times in Syracuse and failed each time. He learned that changing external politics without changing souls accomplishes nothing. But changing souls, educating people to understand the forms and order their lives accordingly, this can succeed. Each student whose soul becomes just is a small victory, a tiny reflection of the ideal city made real in an individual human life. The obvious answer to who should rule is those who want to rule. People compete for political office, campaign, make promises, work to gain power. The winners rule. This is how most cities operate. But it is exactly backwards. The people who want to rule are precisely the people who should not rule. Their desire for power shows they want it for the wrong reasons. Someone who wants political power wants it for what it brings: wealth, prestige, the ability to benefit themselves and their friends, the pleasure of commanding others. These motivations guarantee bad government. A ruler seeking wealth will make decisions that enrich themselves rather than benefit the city. A ruler seeking prestige will pursue showy policies that look good but accomplish little. A ruler seeking to benefit friends will favor their associates over strangers regardless of merit. The only person fit to rule is someone who does not want to rule, who sees ruling as a burden rather than an opportunity, who would prefer to spend their time doing something else. This seems to make good government impossible. If the qualified people refuse to rule and only the unqualified want to, how can a city ever be well governed? The answer requires completely restructuring how rulers are chosen and trained. You cannot wait for qualified people to volunteer. You must identify them young, educate them specifically for ruling, and compel them to serve when their education is complete. This is what happens in the ideal city. The process begins in childhood. All children of guardians are observed carefully. Most will become ordinary guardians, warriors who defend the city but do not rule it. A few show unusual intelligence, unusual capacity for learning, unusual stability of character. These few are selected for further education. Their training starts with mathematics, not practical arithmetic for commerce, but pure mathematics. Geometry, number theory, abstract relationships that have nothing to do with physical objects. This trains the mind to work with non-physical realities, to think about things that cannot be seen or touched. It prepares the intellect for philosophy. They study for years. Mathematics first, then astronomy, then harmonics, all treated as abstract sciences rather than practical skills. They are learning to turn their minds away from the physical world toward eternal truths. At around age 30, if they have succeeded in these studies, they begin dialectic. Dialectic is the method Socrates practiced, taking a concept like justice or courage or beauty, examining it through questions and arguments, testing definitions, looking for contradictions, pursuing the inquiry until you reach bedrock, until you grasp the form itself. This is dangerous. Young people who learn dialectic often misuse it, deploying it to destroy all beliefs without building anything in their place. They become nihilists, thinking everything is equally questionable, trusting nothing. Therefore, dialectic is reserved for those who are older, whose characters are already formed, who have proven their stability. They spend years in dialectical training, learning to examine every assumption, to follow arguments wherever they lead, to accept truth even when it conflicts with comfortable opinions. If successful, around age 35, they are ready for the final stage. They must leave their studies and return to practical life. They serve in military positions, in administrative roles, gaining experience of how the city actually functions. This lasts 15 years. It seems like a step backward, abandoning philosophical inquiry for mundane duties. But it serves a purpose. The future ruler must understand the city from the inside, must know how ordinary people live and think, must not be purely theoretical. At age 50, if they have excelled in all previous stages, they are finally ready. They are taken back to philosophical study, but now with a specific goal. They must perceive the form of the good itself. Not just understand it theoretically, not just grasp arguments about it, but actually perceive it directly. See it with the mind's eye as clearly as physical eyes see the sun. This is the qualification for ruling. The person who has seen the good itself knows what is genuinely beneficial, what truly serves human flourishing, what makes a city and its citizens actually happy. They are not guessing or following tradition or doing what seems popular. They know. Their knowledge is certain, based on direct perception of ultimate reality. These philosophers then rule for the rest of their lives, taking turns so that some can continue studying while others govern. They do not want to rule, they would much rather spend all their time contemplating the forms, but they are compelled by duty. The city educated them, invested decades in their training. They owe the city their service, and they understand that if they refuse, someone less qualified will rule and the city will suffer. Their disinterest in ruling is what makes them trustworthy. They cannot be bribed because they do not value wealth. They already have everything they truly want: knowledge of the forms, opportunity to contemplate them, leisure for philosophy when not actively governing. Material possessions mean nothing to them. They own nothing privately, live communally, share everything. They cannot be manipulated through family because they have no private families. Their children are raised communally with all other guardian children. They do not know which specific children are theirs biologically. They regard all children of the next generation as equally their children, all adults of their generation as siblings, all people of the older generation as parents. This eliminates family loyalty as a corrupting influence. They cannot be threatened or intimidated because they do not fear death. Philosophy has taught them that the soul is immortal, that death merely releases it from the body, that a life lived justly leads to a good fate after death. They will not compromise their principles to preserve their lives. Like Socrates drinking hemlock, they will die rather than rule unjustly. Women can be philosopher rulers just as men can. This was a radical claim in Plato's Athens, where women had essentially no public role. But Plato argues that the capacity for philosophy depends on the soul, not the body. Some souls are capable of grasping the forms regardless of whether they are born into male or female bodies. Therefore, women guardians receive the same education as men, train alongside them, compete equally for selection as rulers. The only relevant differences between people are intellectual and moral, not physical. Some souls are naturally suited for philosophy, others for warfare, others for crafts and trades. These differences have nothing to do with sex or birth or social class in any conventional sense. They are differences in the soul itself, in its nature and capacities. A city that excludes half its population from guardian roles purely based on biology is wasting potential philosophers, weakening itself unnecessarily. The philosopher-ruler faces a unique difficulty. They know what is good for the city, but they must govern people who do not know, who still see only shadows, who will resist policies that would actually benefit them. The masses want what they want, not what they need. They vote for pleasant lies over difficult truths. They honor demagogues who tell them they are wise when they are actually ignorant. The philosopher cannot simply explain the truth. Most people are incapable of understanding it. They have not been educated in mathematics and dialectic. They cannot perceive the forms. When the philosopher talks about the good itself, about organizing the city to reflect eternal realities, the masses hear empty abstractions. They think the philosopher is impractical, out of touch, unsuited for governing. Therefore, the philosopher must rule somewhat indirectly. The productive class is told what to do without being given full explanations. They trust that the rulers know best, accept guidance without understanding its ultimate justification. This is not tyranny if the rulers truly are wise, truly do know what is good, truly are acting for the benefit of all rather than for themselves. The guardians understand more. They have been educated in courage and honor, trained to value the city above themselves. They grasp that the rulers possess knowledge they lack. They accept philosophical guidance willingly, enforcing the ruler's decisions, defending the city against external and internal threats. They do not need to understand the forms themselves. They need only to trust those who do. This creates a stable hierarchy. Knowledge at the top, courage and trust in the middle, productive work at the bottom. Each level performs its function, accepts its role, does not attempt to usurp the role of others. The result is a city that operates smoothly, where decisions are made by those qualified to make them, where each person does what they are naturally suited for, where the whole is oriented toward genuine goodness rather than apparent benefit. Such a city would be nearly invulnerable. External enemies could not conquer it because its guardians are well-trained and highly motivated. Internal faction could not arise because no one has private interests that conflict with the city's interests. Economic problems could not occur because the rulers understand what genuine prosperity is, not mere accumulation of wealth, but the right ordering of the city's resources toward human flourishing. The only threat is time. Even the best city will eventually decay. Future generations might not maintain the educational standards. Rulers might arise who seem qualified but actually are not. Small corruptions might appear and grow. The ideal is not sustainable indefinitely in the physical world. Everything physical changes and decays. Only the form of city remains perfect and eternal. But knowing the ideal is still valuable. It provides a standard for judging actual cities. It shows what to aim for, what to try to approximate, what features make a city better or worse. No actual city will match the ideal, but some will come closer than others. Understanding why helps diagnose political problems and suggest solutions, even if perfect government remains impossible in practice. The philosopher-ruler is ultimately a tragic figure. They possess the highest knowledge, have seen the greatest reality, understand what is truly valuable. But they must spend their time dealing with practical politics, with people who do not understand, with endless mundane problems. They do this from duty, from obligation, from recognition that someone must govern and they are the only ones qualified. But their hearts remain in the realm of forms, in the pure study of eternal truth, in the philosophical life they prefer but cannot fully live. Nothing in the physical world lasts forever. Cities rise and fall, governments change. Even the best possible city, if it somehow came into existence, would eventually decay. The decline follows a pattern, a sequence of stages, each worse than the last. Understanding this pattern reveals something fundamental about human nature and political life. Start with the ideal city ruled by philosophers. Call this aristocracy, rule by the best. Everyone does what they are naturally suited for. Reason rules both in the city and in the souls of citizens. Justice prevails. This is as good as a city can be, but it cannot last. The first problem is generational. The philosopher-rulers understand the forms, but they cannot guarantee their children will inherit this capacity. They try. They arrange matings carefully, trying to breed better souls. But the patterns governing such things are subtle, involving mathematical relationships they cannot fully grasp. Eventually, they make mistakes. Children are born who seem qualified but actually are not. These inferior individuals enter the guardian class. They appear to have the right character, pass through the early stages of education successfully, but they lack the capacity for true philosophy. When their turn comes to rule, they cannot perceive the forms. They rely on opinion instead of knowledge. Small errors enter policy. The decline begins. As the rulers become less philosophical, they start valuing things philosophers should not value. They notice that some metals are more valuable than others. Gold and silver catch their attention. They begin wanting private property. The communal life seems burdensome. Why should they share everything when they could own things individually? They are the rulers after all. Do they not deserve rewards? Once private property appears among the rulers, the city transforms. It becomes a democracy ruled by those who seek honor and prestige. The guardians now own land, accumulate wealth, compete with each other for status. They still value courage and maintain military training, but they are no longer purely focused on the city's good. They want personal glory, want to be honored, want to win. In their souls, spirit has taken over from reason. They still have spirited qualities, courage, competitiveness, desire for excellence, but these now operate without rational guidance. They pursue honor for its own sake, not because honor attaches to what is genuinely good. They despise philosophy as impractical. They value physical training over intellectual training. The education system changes to reflect this. Children in a timocratic city grow up watching their fathers pursue wealth and honor. They learn that these things matter most. But some children notice that their fathers, for all their talk of honor, are actually just accumulating money. The speeches about virtue sound hollow next to the reality of property acquisition. These children become cynical. Why pretend honor matters when really everyone just wants wealth? Better to pursue wealth openly, honestly. When these cynical children grow up and take power, democracy becomes oligarchy, ruled by the wealthy. The city is now explicitly organized around property. Political rights depend on wealth. Only those who own a certain amount can participate in government. The rich rule openly. They use their power to protect their wealth and acquire more. The poor are excluded entirely. Oligarchy creates a divided city. The rich and the poor live side by side but are effectively in different worlds. The rich spend ostentatiously, live in luxury, do no productive work. The poor labor constantly, barely survive, watch the rich waste resources on pleasure. Resentment builds. The poor vastly outnumber the rich. Eventually, through revolution or simply through the rich destroying each other in conflicts over wealth, oligarchy falls. Democracy emerges from this collapse. The poor seize power. They execute or exile the rich, confiscate their property, distribute it among themselves. Everyone is now equal. Everyone has political rights. Anyone can speak in the assembly, can hold office, can pursue whatever life they choose. Freedom and equality are the supreme values. This looks like improvement. Democracy seems more just than oligarchy, where most people were excluded. But Plato sees it as further decay. In democracy, appetite rules completely. People do whatever they want. They pursue pleasure without shame. They call this freedom. No one accepts authority. Students treat teachers as equals. Children disobey parents. No one wants to be ruled. Everyone wants to do as they please. The democratic city is chaos. Decisions are made by majority vote among people who have no expertise. Clever speakers manipulate the assembly, telling people what they want to hear. Demagogues compete to offer the most appealing promises. Policies lurch from one extreme to another as popular opinion shifts. Nothing coherent gets accomplished. In democratic souls, desires multiply wildly. Necessary desires for food and basic comfort are joined by unnecessary desires for luxury, for exotic pleasures, for constant entertainment. The person pursues whatever desire is strongest at the moment. Today they drink heavily, tomorrow they exercise obsessively, next week they are absorbed in some new hobby. No organizing principle guides them. Appetite commands and reason obeys, taking whatever desire happens to be loudest as its master. This freedom eventually destroys itself. When everyone does exactly what they want, when no authority is accepted, when every desire is indulged, problems accumulate. The city cannot defend itself effectively because no one wants to serve in the military. Economic issues arise because no one wants to do difficult work. Crime increases because no one respects law. Into this chaos steps a champion of the people, someone who claims to represent ordinary citizens against corrupt elites, who promises to solve all problems, who blames specific groups for the city's troubles. The masses, desperate for order, give this person power. The demagogue uses that power to eliminate rivals, to silence criticism, to establish personal rule. Democracy becomes tyranny. The tyrant is a slave to his own appetites. He trusts no one because he knows how he obtained power and fears others will do the same. He surrounds himself with bodyguards, often foreign mercenaries, because he cannot trust his own citizens. He starts wars to keep people distracted and to justify his emergency powers. He confiscates property from the wealthy to fund his extravagances. He kills anyone who might threaten his position. In the tyrant's soul, appetite rules absolutely. The worst desires, the ones that appear in dreams but that decent people suppress when awake, take control. The tyrant acts out every forbidden impulse. He seduces whom he wants, kills whom he wants, takes what he wants, but he is never satisfied. Desire breeds desire. Each satisfaction generates new cravings. The tyrant is the least happy person in the city, enslaved to his own appetites, paranoid and terrified, living in constant fear of assassination. This is the complete sequence. Aristocracy decays into timocracy when rulers start valuing honor over wisdom. Timocracy decays into oligarchy when the pursuit of honor reveals itself as pursuit of wealth. Oligarchy decays into democracy when the poor rebel against the rich. Democracy decays into tyranny when freedom without limits becomes chaos requiring a strong man. Each stage is worse than the last. Each involves a further descent from reason toward appetite, from order toward chaos, from justice toward injustice. The same pattern appears in individual souls. The aristocratic person is ruled by reason, lives philosophically, pursues truth. Their child, watching them, thinks they are too idealistic and becomes timocratic, valuing honor and courage. The timocratic person's child sees through the pretense and becomes oligarchic, pursuing wealth openly. The oligarchic person's child rebels against repression and becomes democratic, indulging every desire in the name of freedom. The democratic person's child, having no limits at all, becomes tyrannical, enslaved to the worst appetites. Each transition makes sense from the perspective of the one undergoing it. The son of an aristocrat does not think he is declining. He thinks he is being more realistic, more practical than his philosophical father. The son of a timocrat thinks he is being more honest, dropping the pretense that honor matters. The son of an oligarch thinks he is finally free, able to pursue pleasure without his father's stern restrictions. The son of a democrat thinks he is finally able to act on his strongest desires without worrying about consequences. But from the outside, from the perspective of someone who understands the forms and knows what genuine goodness is, each step is decline. Each generation moves further from reason and closer to appetite, further from reality and closer to illusion, further from happiness and closer to misery, despite thinking they are doing the opposite. This pattern is not inevitable in every case. Individual people can resist it through philosophical education, through turning their souls toward the forms, through establishing reason as ruler in themselves. But cities as a whole cannot resist it indefinitely. The best possible city, if it existed, would eventually decay. The forces of change are too strong. Physical reality does not allow permanence. The only escape is recognition that true justice, true happiness, true goodness cannot be fully realized in any physical city. They exist perfectly only in the realm of forms. The form of city is perfect and eternal, but no actual city can match it. The best you can do is understand the ideal, see how far actual cities fall short, and try to approximate the ideal as closely as circumstances allow. In your own soul, you can do better. You can make yourself just, can establish reason as ruler, can orient your life toward the forms. External political decay cannot prevent internal philosophical success. The body stops breathing, the heart stops beating, but the soul does not die. It cannot die. Death is the separation of soul from body, not the end of existence. The soul existed before birth and continues after death. What happens to it depends on how the person lived. A soldier named died in battle. His body was collected with others and laid out for burial. 10 days later, when the funeral pyre was prepared, his body had not decayed. Then, as they were about to burn him, he came back to life. He told them what he had seen. His soul left his body and traveled with many other souls to a place of judgment. There were 2 openings in the earth and 2 in the sky above. Judges sat between them, examining each soul. The just were directed to the right opening leading upward into the sky. The unjust were directed to the left opening leading down into the earth. Himself was told to watch and remember everything, to return and tell the living what happens after death. He saw souls emerging from the other 2 openings. Some came up from the earth, covered in dust, weary from a long journey underground. Others descended from the sky, clean and peaceful, speaking of wonders they had seen. These souls from above and below met in a meadow, greeting old friends, exchanging stories of their journeys. Those coming from beneath the earth had traveled for 1,000 years. They had been punished for their injustices. For every wrong they committed during life, they suffered tenfold in the afterlife. A person who lived 70 years and committed many wrongs spent 700 years being punished for them. Tyrants and great criminals suffered even more terribly. Some were not released at all, but were dragged deeper into the earth when they tried to escape, to suffer eternally. Those descending from the sky had also traveled for 1,000 years, but in bliss. They were rewarded tenfold for every just action, every philosophical insight, every moment spent in pursuit of truth. They had seen wonders, perceived realities impossible to describe, experienced joy beyond anything available in physical life. After 7 days in the meadow, all the souls journeyed onward. They traveled for 4 days until they came to a place where they could see a shaft of light stretching through the entire cosmos, like a pillar holding everything together. There, they perceived the structure of the universe itself, the orbits of planets and stars, the mathematical harmonies governing celestial movements. Then they came to the 3 fates, daughters of necessity. The first fate sang of the past, the second of the present, the third of the future. A spokesman explained that the souls would now choose their next lives. The choice was theirs alone. The responsibility was entirely on each soul for what it chose. The spokesman laid out patterns of lives. There were lives of tyrants, of powerful politicians, of wealthy merchants, of craftsmen, of animals of various kinds, of men and women in different circumstances. Far more patterns than there were souls choosing. Each soul would select in order determined by lot, but even the last soul to choose would find acceptable options available. The quality of the next life depended on choosing wisely, not on the order of choosing. The first soul to choose, given priority by the luck of the draw, rushed forward and grabbed the life of a great tyrant. Only after selecting did this soul examine the choice carefully. Too late, it saw that this tyrant's life included killing his own children and committing many other horrors. The soul wept and blamed fortune and the gods, blamed anything except its own foolish haste. Watched as soul after soul chose. Many repeated the mistakes of their previous lives. Those who had suffered in the underworld but had not become wise through suffering often chose badly, selecting lives that would lead to more suffering. They were like the cave prisoners who, after being dragged up and then returning, immediately went back to staring at shadows. But some chose wisely. One soul that had lived justly by habit in a well-ordered city but without philosophy chose carefully, selecting a moderate good life. Another soul, that of Odysseus, came last to choose. This soul remembered its previous life of struggles and fame, had grown weary of ambition. It searched for a long time and finally selected the life of an ordinary person who minded their own business. The soul said it would have made the same choice even if it had chosen first. After all had chosen, they drank from the river of forgetfulness. Most drank deeply and forgot everything, their previous life, their time in the afterlife, the choice they had just made, everything. A few drank less, retaining dim memories. Then they slept, and at midnight each soul was carried away like a shooting star to be born into its chosen life. Himself was prevented from drinking. He did not know how he returned to his body, but suddenly he was awake on the funeral pyre, able to tell what he had seen. This story reveals several things about the soul and death. First, the soul is judged. Actions during life have consequences after death. You cannot escape justice by dying. Whatever you did, you will answer for it. The person who lived unjustly thinking they escaped punishment discovers that punishment was merely delayed. Second, the punishment and reward are temporary for most souls. 1,000 years seems infinite from a human perspective, but it is a finite period. After it ends, the soul returns to choose a new life. Only the worst criminals suffer eternally. Most souls cycle through death, judgment, reward or punishment, choice, birth, life, death again. Third, the choice of the next life is free. The gods do not assign lives. The fates do not determine destinies. Each soul chooses for itself. The responsibility is entirely its own. This means you cannot blame circumstances for how you live. Before birth, your soul chose these circumstances. If you live badly, you chose badly. If you suffer unjustly, you chose a life where this would happen. Fourth, wisdom matters more than anything. The souls that chose well were not those who had been rewarded, who came down from the sky after 1,000 years of bliss. Many of those chose foolishly, having never learned to examine their lives critically. The souls that chose well were those who had practiced philosophy, who understood what makes a life genuinely good, who were not dazzled by power or wealth or fame. The soul of Odysseus is the example. After a life of adventure and suffering, after being famous and powerful, after achieving everything the heroic life offers, this soul wanted something different. It chose an ordinary quiet life, a life the first soul to choose would have scorned as worthless. But Odysseus had learned what actually matters. Fame and power bring suffering. The philosophical life, even in modest circumstances, brings genuine happiness. Fifth, most people learn nothing from their experiences. They suffer, are punished for 1,000 years, return to choose a new life, and immediately choose another life that will lead to more suffering. They are like gamblers who lose everything, swear they have learned their lesson, then return to the casino the moment they have money again. Experience alone teaches nothing. Only philosophy, only examined life, only understanding the forms creates real wisdom. The soul's immortality is provable through reason, not just asserted through myths. The soul is the principle of life in a body. Whatever is alive because a soul is present in it. When the soul departs, the body dies. But the soul itself cannot die because it is life itself, the thing that makes other things alive. Death is opposite to life, and the soul by its nature cannot admit its opposite. Fire cannot become cold, snow cannot become hot, the soul cannot become dead. This argument has force but is not complete. It shows the soul does not die when the body dies, but does it show that the soul is eternal, that it always existed and always will exist? Other arguments address this. The soul can perceive the forms, which are eternal and unchanging. Only something that is itself eternal could perceive eternal realities. Physical things change constantly and can only perceive other changing physical things. The soul's ability to grasp mathematics, to understand perfect circles and triangles that do not exist physically, proves it belongs to the eternal realm. Also, the soul is simple, not composite. Physical things are combinations of elements. Earth, water, air, fire mix together to create bodies. When a body dies, it decomposes, breaks apart into its elements. But the soul has no parts. It is a unity. What has no parts cannot decompose. What cannot decompose cannot be destroyed. Therefore, the soul is indestructible, immortal. This immortality creates urgent practical consequences. If you live 70 years and then stop existing, justice during those 70 years matters only moderately. You might escape punishment, might get away with crimes, might die before facing consequences. But if you are immortal, if those 70 years are an infinitesimal fraction of your existence, then how you live them determines your fate for periods vastly longer. The criminal who escapes earthly justice will face 1,000 years of punishment. The philosopher who is persecuted and executed will receive 1,000 years of reward. Therefore, death should not be feared. The good person has nothing to fear from death. Socrates, going calmly to drink the hemlock, was not pretending or putting on a show. He genuinely had no fear because he understood what death actually is. The separation of soul from body releases the soul to return to the realm it belongs to perceive the forms directly again, to know perfectly what it now knows imperfectly. The bad person should fear death, but usually does not. Tyrants cling desperately to life, trying to avoid death by any means. But this is not because they understand the consequences of their injustice. It is because they are enslaved to bodily pleasures and fear losing them. If they truly understood what awaits them after death, they would be terrified. Their ignorance of the soul's immortality is perhaps a mercy, allowing them to die without knowing what is coming. The philosophical life is preparation for death. Not in a morbid way, but in the sense that philosophy is about separating the soul from the body's concerns even while alive. The philosopher trains to ignore bodily pleasures and pains, to focus on intellectual pursuits, to live as much as possible in the realm of thought rather than sensation. Death simply completes this process the philosopher has already begun. The cycle of reincarnation also explains why some people seem naturally virtuous, while others seem naturally vicious. These are not random differences. They reflect choices made before birth. The soul that chose a philosophical life brings into it some residue of previous philosophical training, even though the details are forgotten. The soul that chose a tyrannical life brings tendencies toward vice. But the choice before birth does not determine everything. Within the broad parameters of the chosen life, each moment still offers choices. The soul that chose a difficult life can still live that life well or badly. The soul that chose an easy life can still waste it through foolishness. The original choice creates circumstances but does not remove freedom. Every action remains the soul's own responsibility. This means you are living a life you chose. Before birth, your soul selected this particular existence with its specific challenges and opportunities. You cannot remember making this choice, but you made it. Therefore, complaining about your circumstances is absurd. You chose them. If you suffer, you chose a life involving suffering, presumably to learn something or accomplish something that required it. The myth of is not literal truth, not a report of what actually happens in some physical location. Plato is using story to communicate philosophical truths that cannot be expressed in straight argument. The details about the meadow and the shaft of light and the fates are images, ways of making abstract realities concrete enough to understand. But the core claims are serious philosophy, not just mythology. The soul is immortal. Actions have consequences beyond death. You will be judged. How you live determines your fate for periods vastly longer than your physical life. Wisdom is the only thing that truly matters. Philosophy is preparation for death and for whatever comes after. Understanding the soul requires recognizing its structure. Within each soul, 3 distinct parts struggle for control: Plato compares them to a charioteer driving two horses. Reason is the charioteer, trying to guide the soul toward truth and virtue. The spirited part, themos, is a noble horse capable of courage, honor, righteous anger, naturally allied with reason when properly educated. Appetite is a wild horse driven by physical desires for food, drink, sex, money, constantly pulling toward base pleasures, requiring firm control. These three parts correspond to three virtues and three classes in the ideal state. Reason should be wise, spirit should be courageous, appetite should be moderate. When reason rules, spirit supports it, and appetite obeys both. The soul is just, living in harmony with itself. Justice in a person is exactly this internal harmony, each part performing its proper function, none usurping the role of others. Most souls are dominated by appetite or spirit, leaving reason as a weak voice ignored or rationalized away. The appetitive person spends life pursuing pleasures, accumulating wealth to fund those pleasures, never satisfied, always wanting more. The spirited person pursues honor, victory, recognition, becoming angry when disrespected, competitive and ambitious. The rational person pursues truth, wants knowledge of reality, cares little for pleasure or honor compared to understanding. The philosopher's task is to strengthen reason until it can truly govern, bringing order to the inner chaos that most people mistake for normal life. This requires years of training, turning the soul away from physical pleasures toward intellectual ones, developing capacity for abstract thought, eventually perceiving the forms themselves. Only then can reason rule effectively, only then is the soul truly just. Most people live as if they will exist forever in their current bodies, or as if death ends everything and therefore nothing matters. Both errors produce bad lives. The first makes people afraid of death and desperate to cling to bodily existence. The second makes people think they can act unjustly without consequences. Understanding that the soul is immortal but the body is not corrects both mistakes. You need not fear death because you will not cease to exist, but you must act justly because you will face judgment for a period vastly longer than your physical life. A painter paints a bed. The painting looks like a bed. Someone who has never seen a real bed might think the painting is a bed. But it is not. It is colored paint on a flat surface. The bed in the painting has no depth, cannot be used for sleeping, is not actually made of wood. It is an image of a bed, not a bed. But the real bed the painter copied is also not truly a bed. There is a form of bed, the perfect pattern that all physical beds imitate. The carpenter who built the bed the painter copied was looking at this form, trying to create in wood something that matches it. The physical bed is already a copy, an imperfect representation of the true bed that exists in the realm of forms. So the painting is a copy of a copy. It is 3 steps removed from reality. The form of bed is the reality. The physical bed is 1 step removed, a copy of the form. The painting is 2 steps removed, a copy of the copy. This makes the painter's knowledge even less than the carpenter's. The carpenter understands something about beds, knows how to make them functional. The painter only knows how to make things look like beds without actually being beds. This applies to all imitative art. The sculptor makes copies of physical bodies, which are themselves copies of the form of human. The poet describes heroes performing actions, but these heroes are copies of the form of courage or justice, and the poet's words are copies of the copy. All art that imitates physical reality is twice removed from truth. Someone might object that great poets like Homer teach people about virtue, that reading about noble heroes makes people better. But examine this claim carefully. What does Homer actually know? He describes warriors fighting, but was he a general? He describes cities being governed, but did he rule any city? He talks about medicine, but could he heal anyone? He presents Achilles as a great hero, but Achilles is a terrible model, driven by pride to let his comrades die, valuing personal honor over the common good. The poet knows nothing about the subjects he treats. He has never perceived the forms of justice or courage. He presents characters who seem just or courageous based on conventional opinion about what these qualities look like. But convention is not knowledge. Most people cannot distinguish true courage from reckless bravery, true justice from mere legality. The poet, working from conventional opinions, produces images that may look right to ignorant people but that do not reflect reality. Worse, poetry appeals to the worst parts of the soul. Consider a tragic play. Someone dies unjustly. The audience weeps. Why are they weeping? If they were actually experiencing such a loss, reason would tell them to bear it calmly, that excessive grief helps nothing, that the soul of the dead person continues to exist. But in the theater, they indulge their emotions, let themselves weep and wail, enjoy the intensity of simulated grief without reason to control it. Poetry feeds the appetitive and spirited parts while starving the rational part. It makes you feel without making you think. The best poetry is the most emotionally powerful, which means it is the best at overwhelming reason with passion. Someone who regularly watches tragedies or reads emotional poetry trains their soul to be ruled by feeling rather than thought. This is dangerous for individuals and for cities. A person whose emotions have been cultivated through poetry becomes harder to govern by reason, both their own reason and the reason of wise rulers. They cry at performances of injustice, but commit injustice themselves without shame. They admire courage in stories, but act cowardly in real life. The emotional reactions produced by art have no connection to actual virtue. Therefore, poetry must be severely restricted in the ideal city. Only hymns to gods and praises of good people are permitted. No tragedies showing gods behaving badly or heroes acting shamefully. No comedies mocking virtue or making vice seem attractive. No emotional music that stirs up dangerous passions. The citizens should see and hear only what will make them better, nothing that will corrupt them. This seems harsh. Why ban Homer, the greatest of Greek poets, whose works everyone admires? But consider what is at stake. The city is trying to create just souls, to educate guardians who will rule wisely or fight courageously. Poetry works against this education. It teaches the wrong lessons, appeals to the wrong parts of the soul, creates the wrong kind of person. The poet might defend themselves by claiming they do teach virtue, that their works contain moral lessons. But this only makes things worse. The poet who deliberately tries to teach is claiming knowledge they do not possess. They have never perceived justice itself, do not understand what they are talking about, but present themselves as moral authorities. They mislead people into thinking conventional opinions about virtue are actual knowledge. Even beautiful poetry about trivial subjects causes harm. Beauty should point the soul toward the form of beauty, should begin the ascent described in the ladder of love. But poetic beauty is empty beauty, beauty in images rather than in reality. The person who admires beautiful poetry thinks they are appreciating beauty when they are actually admiring clever imitation. They stop on the first rung of the ladder, never climbing higher. Visual arts have the same problems. Painters create images that look real but are not. Sculptors make statues that resemble humans but lack souls, lack reason, lack everything that makes a human actually human. These arts cultivate the habit of mistaking appearance for reality, of being satisfied with surfaces, of thinking that seeing is understanding. The only legitimate arts are those that help turn the soul toward truth. Music that promotes orderly emotions and rational control is acceptable. Architecture that creates buildings serving good purposes is acceptable. Poetry that praises virtue without imitating vice is acceptable. But imitative arts, arts that copy physical reality, arts that appeal to emotion rather than reason, these must be excluded. This does not mean beauty is unimportant. Beauty is immensely important. The form of beauty is one of the highest realities. But physical beauty, beauty in images and sounds, is valuable only when it points beyond itself toward the form. Art that stops at physical beauty, that makes people think beautiful images are enough, prevents them from seeking real beauty. The artist might protest that they are not claiming to teach truth, that art is just entertainment. But this is no defense. Entertainment that corrupts is worse than serious teaching that misleads. The person who knows they are being taught can question and resist. The person who thinks they are just being entertained absorbs lessons without noticing, forms habits without realizing it, becomes worse without understanding why. Also, artists do claim authority. Poets are honored, treated as wise, quoted as sources of moral guidance. Painters and sculptors receive commissions for temples and public buildings, creating images that shape how people think about gods and heroes. To say art is just entertainment while accepting this honor and influence is dishonest. The deeper problem is that imitation itself is corrupting. When you practice imitating different characters, pretending to be someone else, adopting different voices and postures and emotions, you damage your own character. Actors are the worst case. They spend their lives pretending to be other people, expressing emotions they do not feel, doing things their actual character would never do. This fragments the soul, prevents it from developing a stable, unified character. Young people especially should never imitate bad characters, even in play. Imitation becomes habit. The child who pretends to be a coward or a fool or a criminal is training themselves in these vices. Even if they know it is pretense, the practice shapes their soul. They should only imitate what they should actually become: the just person, the courageous person, the wise person. This creates difficulties for drama, which requires actors to portray all kinds of characters. The good actor can play villains convincingly, can show cowardice and injustice and vice in ways that seem real. This means the good actor must practice vice, must cultivate the ability to appear cowardly or unjust or foolish. Such practice cannot leave the soul unharmed. Therefore, there can be no drama in the ideal city, No actors, no playwrights, no theatrical performances. If poets arrive from other cities and ask to perform, they should be honored as guests, perhaps given gifts, and sent away. The city cannot allow them to corrupt the citizens, no matter how entertaining or prestigious their art might be. This applies even to Plato's own dialogues. They are imitations, artistic creations, featuring characters speaking words they may never have spoken. But Plato is not writing for entertainment. He is using artistic form to communicate philosophical truth, creating dialogues that lead readers toward understanding the forms. The artistic element is means to philosophical ends, not an end in itself. The complete rejection of imitative art seems extreme to readers who live in cultures that value art highly. But Plato is serious. He has examined what art does to the soul, how it affects the parts and their relationships, what kinds of people it creates. His conclusion is that most art is harmful, that cities serious about justice and happiness must severely restrict it. This does not mean everyone must live without beauty. Beauty should be everywhere in the ideal city. Buildings should be well proportioned. Music should be harmonious. Daily life should have grace and order. But the beauty should be real beauty that reflects the forms, not imitative beauty that copies physical appearances. The difference is crucial. One leads the soul toward truth. The other traps it in illusion. Plato wrote dialogues, dozens of them, hundreds of pages, perhaps hundreds of thousands of words across his lifetime. Yet in one of these dialogues, he presents Socrates arguing that writing is fundamentally inferior to spoken conversation, that it damages memory, that it cannot teach anyone anything important. This creates an obvious question. If Plato believed writing was so flawed, why did he write so much? The answer reveals something about the relationship between philosophy and language, between knowledge and communication, between what can be said and what can only be understood through direct experience. Socrates tells a story. The Egyptian god Thayuth invented writing and presented it to King Thamus, claiming it would make people wiser and improve their memory. But Thamus rejected it. Writing will do the opposite, he said. People who rely on written records will stop exercising their memory. They will seem to know many things because they can consult texts, but they will not actually know anything. They will have the appearance of wisdom without the reality. Writing is like painting. A painting looks alive but cannot respond. You can ask it questions and it just stares back silently. Written words are the same. They seem to contain knowledge, but if you ask them to explain themselves or to clarify a difficult point, they simply repeat the same words. They cannot adapt to the listener, cannot tell when they are being misunderstood, cannot defend themselves against misinterpretation. Living speech is different. In conversation, the speaker can see whether the listener understands. If confusion appears, the speaker can rephrase, can provide examples, can approach the same idea from a different angle. If the listener raises objections, the speaker can address them. The exchange is dynamic, flexible, responsive to the particular person and situation. Also, speech can be targeted. The wise speaker says different things to different listeners, giving each person what they need at their level of understanding. The beginning student needs simple examples and basic concepts. The advanced student needs complex arguments and difficult problems. But a written text says the same thing to everyone, to the expert and the beginner alike, to the person ready to understand and the person who will only be confused. Even worse, writing falls into inappropriate hands. A philosophical text might be read by someone with no training, no context, no preparation. They will misunderstand it, will take metaphors literally or literal statements as metaphors, will extract conclusions the author never intended. The written word cannot say, "You are not ready for this," or "You are misunderstanding," or "This requires background you do not have." It sits there passively, available to anyone who can read. This makes writing dangerous for philosophy. Philosophical truths are subtle, easily distorted, prone to misunderstanding. The person who reads a philosophical text without proper education is like someone given a map without knowing how to read maps. They might think they understand, might feel they have grasped something important, but they are actually more confused than before because they now have false confidence in wrong ideas. Therefore, the real philosopher does not rely on writing. The real teaching happens in person, through conversation, through the dialectical method where two people examine a question together. The teacher asks questions. The student answers. The teacher shows where the answers lead to contradictions. The student tries new answers. Gradually, through this process, understanding emerges. This understanding is not information transferred from teacher to student. It is knowledge the student already possesses, buried in their soul from before birth. The teacher is merely helping them remember, helping them access what they already know. This process cannot be done through writing. It requires the living presence of someone who knows, someone who can guide the specific individual through their specific confusions toward their specific insights. So why does Plato write? One answer is that writing serves as a reminder. For someone who has already engaged in philosophical conversation, who has already worked through the dialectical process, a written dialogue can trigger memory. Reading about Socrates questioning someone about justice might remind you of similar conversations you have had, might help you recall insights you achieved but have partially forgotten. The text is not teaching you something new. It is helping you remember what you already learned through actual philosophical dialogue. Another answer is that writing can identify people who are ready for philosophy. Someone who reads Plato's dialogues and finds them confusing or boring is not ready. But someone who reads them and becomes fascinated, who wants to understand more, who recognizes that something important is being discussed even if they do not fully grasp it yet, this person is a potential philosopher. They can be invited to join actual philosophical conversation, can begin real education. The written dialogues serve as advertisements or screening tools, not as the philosophy itself. A third answer is that some things simply cannot be written at all. Plato hints repeatedly that his most important doctrines have never been written, that he teaches them only orally to advanced students in the academy. There are truths too subtle, too easily misunderstood, too dangerous in the wrong hands to be put into texts that anyone might read. These truths can only be communicated person to person when the teacher judges the student ready. What are these unwritten doctrines? The dialogues give hints, something about the ultimate principles, about what lies beyond even the forms, about the one and the principle of multiplicity. Something about how the forms relate to numbers, how mathematics connects to metaphysics, something about the generation of soul and cosmos. But the details remain unclear because Plato deliberately kept them out of his writings. This creates frustration for later readers who want to know what Plato really thought. His students wrote about some of his oral teachings, but these second-hand reports are difficult to interpret and possibly unreliable. The most important parts of his philosophy may have been lost entirely when the last person who heard them directly from him died. If so, this was intentional. Plato wanted it that way. The reason connects to the nature of the highest knowledge. To understand the form of the good, to grasp the ultimate principles, requires not just intellectual training, but transformation of the entire soul. The person must become a certain kind of person, must purify themselves of attachment to physical things, must turn their soul entirely toward the eternal. This cannot be accomplished by reading. It requires years of discipline, of mathematical study, of dialectical practice, of living philosophically. Someone who has undergone this transformation can understand the highest teachings. Someone who has not will only be confused or will think they understand when they actually do not. Putting these teachings in writing guarantees they will be misunderstood because most readers will not have the necessary preparation. Better to keep them oral, shared only with those who have proven themselves ready through years of study and practice. This creates an apparent paradox. Philosophy aims at truth, at making knowledge available, at helping souls escape ignorance. But the highest philosophy is deliberately kept secret, shared only with a small elite, withheld from the many. Is this not a betrayal of philosophy's mission? Plato's answer is no. Truth cannot be given to someone who is not ready for it. Attempting to do so accomplishes nothing. The unprepared person either rejects the truth or accepts a distorted version of it. Neither outcome serves philosophy. The only way to share truth is to prepare people to receive it, which requires personal instruction, careful guidance through a long educational process. This cannot be done through writing for the masses. The dialogues themselves demonstrate this principle. They are not straightforward presentations of doctrine. They are dramatic scenes showing people thinking together, often failing to reach clear conclusions, sometimes contradicting things said in other dialogues. Readers must work to understand them, must think for themselves rather than passively receiving information. This is deliberate. Plato is not trying to make things easy. He is trying to make readers into philosophers. Someone who reads a dialogue and says, "Now I understand Plato's theory of forms," has probably missed the point. The dialogue is not presenting a theory to be memorized. It is demonstrating a method, showing how to think about difficult questions, inviting readers to pursue these questions themselves. The content matters less than the process. This understanding of writing's limitations affects how we should read Plato. We should not expect the dialogues to contain his complete philosophy. We should not assume that what Socrates says in the dialogues is exactly what Plato believed. We should recognize that we are reading one side of a conversation, the other side of which was happening in person at the academy with students we cannot hear. The dialogues are incomplete by design. They point toward truths they do not fully state. They raise questions they do not fully answer. They create perplexity rather than providing certainty. This is not a flaw. This is their purpose. A reader who finishes a dialogue feeling confused but curious, uncertain but eager to understand more, has received exactly what Plato intended. The relationship between writing and philosophy remains problematic even with these explanations. Plato lived in a transitional time when writing was relatively new as a tool for philosophy. Before him, philosophy was entirely oral. Socrates represented this older tradition, teaching through conversation, leaving nothing written. After Plato, philosophy became increasingly a written discipline, with treatises and commentaries and textbooks. Plato stands between these two modes. He writes extensively but remains suspicious of writing. He creates texts but denies that texts can contain the most important knowledge. He publishes dialogues but keeps the highest teachings private. This tension never resolves. He simply holds both positions simultaneously, writing prolifically while insisting that writing is inadequate for philosophy. Perhaps this is itself a philosophical teaching. Perhaps the point is that truth cannot be fully captured in any fixed form, that knowledge always exceeds what can be said about it, that the highest realities can only be approached through direct experience that goes beyond language entirely. If so, then every written text, including Plato's own dialogues, is necessarily inadequate. The best a text can do is point beyond itself, is gesture toward truths it cannot contain, is create in readers the desire to pursue understanding through means other than reading. The dialogue is not the philosophy. The dialogue is an invitation to philosophy. This makes reading Plato fundamentally different from reading most other philosophers. You cannot simply extract propositions from the text and say, this is what Plato believed. You must engage with the text actively, must think along with the characters, must notice what is not said as much as what is said, must recognize that the deepest insights might be communicated indirectly through dramatic structure and literary art, rather than through explicit statements. The written dialogues are like fingers pointing at the moon. You are supposed to look at the moon, not at the finger. But most readers stare at the finger, analyzing it in detail, describing its exact shape and position, never glancing at what it points toward. To read Plato correctly is to use the dialogues as they were intended, as aids to living philosophical conversation, as reminders of truths accessible only through direct experience, as invitations to a process that goes far beyond reading. A carpenter builds a table. To do it well, the carpenter needs to understand geometry. The surface must be flat, the angles must be right angles, the legs must be equal in length. But the carpenter is not thinking about the form of flatness or the form of right angle. The carpenter is thinking about this piece of wood and how to cut it to fit with that piece of wood. A mathematician studies triangles, not this triangle drawn on papyrus or that triangle constructed from wood, but triangle itself, the abstract object that all physical triangles imperfectly imitate. The mathematician proves that the interior angles of any triangle sum to two right angles. This proof is not about physical triangles, which always have some imperfection. It is about the perfect triangle, the mathematical object that exists nowhere in physical space. Mathematics occupies a strange middle position. It is not about physical objects, not about the changing world of sense experience. Mathematical truths are eternal, unchanging, necessary. They were true before any human thought about them, and will remain true after humanity is gone. In this way, mathematics resembles the forms. But mathematics is also not quite the same as the highest forms. The mathematician still relies on diagrams, still draws circles and triangles to illustrate arguments, still uses physical examples even while knowing the proofs are not about these examples. The mathematician has not fully escaped the physical world, has not achieved pure intellectual vision of the forms themselves. This makes mathematics perfect for education. It is harder than studying physical things because mathematical objects cannot be seen or touched. But it is easier than grasping the highest forms because you can use diagrams and examples to help your thinking. Mathematics trains the mind to work with abstractions while still providing some concrete support. Above the entrance to Plato's academy was supposedly an inscription, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter." This was not arbitrary. Geometry was the foundation of philosophical education. Before you could study dialectic, before you could attempt to grasp the forms, you had to train your mind in mathematical thinking. Why geometry specifically? Because geometry makes clear the difference between physical things and intelligible objects. You can draw a circle on papyrus, but the drawn circle is not the circle the geometer studies. The drawn circle has thickness to its line. The geometer's circle is defined as the set of all points equidistant from a center point, and this definition applies to a perfect circle that no physical drawing can match. Yet the drawn circle helps you think about the perfect circle. You cannot visualize the perfect circle directly because it has no physical existence, but you can draw an imperfect version and then use your mind to think past the imperfections to the mathematical object itself. The drawing is a ladder you climb and then abandon. This process mirrors philosophical education generally. Physical beauty helps you think about beauty itself. Just actions help you understand justice itself. But you must learn to think past the physical examples to the forms they imperfectly reflect. Mathematics teaches this skill directly. Numbers are even more abstract than geometric figures. The number 3 does not exist anywhere in space. You can have 3 apples or 3 stones, but these are not the number 3. They are physical objects that happen to be 3 in quantity. The number itself is a purely intelligible object. Arithmetic trains the mind to think about these purely intelligible objects. When you prove that 3 plus 2 equals 5, you are not making a claim about physical things. You are discovering a necessary truth about numbers themselves. This truth holds in all possible worlds, under all possible circumstances, eternally and unchangingly. The Pythagoreans, who influenced Plato heavily, saw numbers as the key to understanding reality. Everything they claimed is number. The harmonies in music can be expressed as numerical ratios. The orbits of planets follow mathematical patterns. The structure of the cosmos itself is mathematical. Plato agreed that mathematics reveals something fundamental about reality, but he did not think everything reduces to numbers. Rather, numbers and mathematical objects exist in the same realm as the forms. They are not identical to forms like beauty and justice, but they are related. Both are eternal, intelligible, accessible only to reason rather than sense perception. This creates a hierarchy of mathematical studies. Arithmetic comes first, the study of pure number, then plane geometry, studying two-dimensional figures, then solid geometry, studying three-dimensional objects. Then astronomy, but not astronomy as observing actual stars and planets. Astronomy as the mathematical study of perfect circular motions, the ideal patterns that physical celestial bodies approximate. Finally, harmonics. Not music as heard with ears, but the mathematical relationships between notes, the numerical ratios that create consonance and dissonance. The Pythagoreans had discovered that pleasant musical intervals correspond to simple numerical ratios. An octave is 2, 1, a fifth is 3, 2, a fourth is 4, 3. These ratios are not just accidents. They reveal something about the mathematical structure of sound itself. Together, these studies form the quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, harmonics. Mastering them prepares the mind for philosophy. They teach abstract thinking, train the soul to work with invisible realities, demonstrate that truth exists beyond the physical world, show how reason can grasp certainties that sense experience cannot provide. But mathematics is still preliminary. The mathematician proves that the angles of a triangle sum to 2 right angles, but does not ask what a triangle really is, what it means for something to be a mathematical object, how these objects relate to forms or to physical things. The mathematician works within a system of axioms and definitions without examining those axioms and definitions critically. This is where dialectic goes beyond mathematics. Dialectic questions the assumptions that mathematics takes for granted. What is number? What is magnitude? What is equality? These seem like simple concepts, so obvious they need no explanation. But examine them closely and they become problematic, raising questions that cannot be answered within mathematics itself. The dialectician ascends from mathematics to its foundations, questioning everything, seeking the ultimate principles that make mathematical truth possible. This leads eventually to the form of the good, which stands above all other forms, which makes all knowledge and all being possible. But you cannot skip mathematics and jump straight to dialectic. The mind that has not been trained in abstract thinking cannot handle dialectical questioning. It gets lost immediately, unable to think about anything not connected to physical experience. Mathematics builds the mental muscles needed for philosophy. Consider how mathematical proof works. You start with definitions and axioms. You derive conclusions by logical steps. Each step is necessary, following from what came before. The conclusion is certain, not probable. There is no room for opinion or debate. The proof either works or it does not. This teaches intellectual rigor. In ordinary life, people argue loosely, jump to conclusions, accept claims without proof. Mathematics does not allow this. Every assertion must be justified. Every inference must be valid. This discipline carries over to philosophy, where the same standards apply. Mathematical objects also demonstrate that knowledge is possible. Skeptics claim we cannot know anything certainly, that all beliefs might be wrong. but mathematical truths are certain. We know that 2 plus 2 equals 4, that the angles of a triangle sum to 2 right angles, that parallel lines never meet. These are not opinions, they are knowledge. If knowledge is possible in mathematics, it must be possible elsewhere. The same kind of reasoning that produces mathematical certainty can be applied to forms. We can know beauty itself, justice itself, goodness itself with the same certainty we know mathematical truths. We just need to apply the same rigorous methods. The mathematical method also reveals something about teaching and learning. A teacher cannot give mathematical knowledge to a student. The teacher can present proofs, but the student must follow the reasoning themselves. Understanding happens in the student's own mind. The teacher guides, but the student does the real work. This mirrors the Socratic method. Knowledge cannot be poured into someone. It must be drawn out, remembered, discovered by the person themselves. Mathematics makes this obvious. No amount of lecturing will make someone understand a proof unless they think through it themselves. Numbers have another important feature. They are ordered. 2 comes after 1, 3 comes after 2, and so forth in a necessary sequence. This ordering is not arbitrary. It is inherent in the nature of numbers themselves. This provides a model for understanding how forms relate to each other. Forms are not just a random collection of separate realities. They have structure, relationships, ordering. Some forms are more fundamental than others. Some depend on others. Understanding these relationships requires thinking mathematically, seeing patterns and structures and hierarchies. The form of the good is like the number 1 in some ways. It is the principle from which everything else derives. Just as all numbers can be understood in relation to 1, all forms can be understood in relation to the good. This is not a precise analogy, but it points toward a mathematical way of thinking about the structure of reality. Plato himself never fully worked out how mathematics relates to the forms. The relationship remains somewhat unclear in the dialogues, but the importance of mathematics for philosophical education is consistent. You cannot be a philosopher without mathematical training. The mind that cannot think mathematically cannot think philosophically. This has practical implications for how to read Plato. Many of his most important arguments involve mathematical reasoning. The discussion of the divided line, the account of how the demiurge created the world soul, the analysis of different political systems all rely on mathematical structures and proportions. A reader without mathematical background will miss much of what Plato is doing. But the point is not that philosophy is mathematics. Philosophy goes beyond mathematics, questions mathematics, seeks the principles that make mathematics possible. Mathematics is the bridge, the path from the physical world of sense experience to the intelligible world of forms. You must cross the bridge, but you do not stop on it. You use it to reach the other side. Before the cosmos existed, there was only chaos. Not nothing but disordered matter, moving randomly, without pattern or purpose. Elements mixed together haphazardly. Motion occurred but led nowhere. Nothing resembled anything else. No regularity, no structure, no intelligible relationships. Then a craftsman, a divine maker, looked at this chaos and decided to impose order. Not from cruelty or boredom, but from goodness. The craftsman was good, and what is good wants to share goodness, wants to create order and beauty rather than leave chaos undisturbed. The craftsman looked toward the forms, toward the eternal patterns of what things should be. Using these as a model, the craftsman began shaping the chaos into a cosmos, an ordered whole. Not creating matter from nothing because matter already existed, but organizing it, giving it structure, making it resemble the eternal patterns as much as physical stuff can resemble eternal forms. First came the world soul. The craftsman took substance that partakes of sameness and substance that partakes of difference, blended them together in precise mathematical proportions. The resulting mixture was divided according to a mathematical series: 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 9, 27. These divisions correspond to musical ratios, to the harmonies that create consonance rather than discord. This world soul was then stretched out and formed into a circle, or rather 2 circles intersecting at an angle. One represents the motion of the same, corresponding to the daily rotation of the heavens. One represents the motion of the different, corresponding to the wandering paths of planets. These circles move eternally, the world soul animating the entire cosmos. Then came the physical body of the world. The craftsman took all the matter that existed, every bit of earth and water and air and fire, and formed it into a sphere. A sphere because this is the most perfect shape, the same in all directions, containing everything within itself. The cosmos became a living being, a sphere with a soul, moving in perfect circles, as close to the eternal forms as anything physical can be. But the cosmos exists in time, and time did not exist before the cosmos. Eternity belongs to the realm of forms. The forms simply are, without past or future, without becoming, without change. They do not endure through time because time does not apply to them. They exist in an eternal now, always fully present, never coming into being or passing away. The physical cosmos cannot be eternal in this sense. Physical things change, move, come into being and pass away. But the craftsman wanted the cosmos to resemble eternity as much as possible. So time was created as a moving image of eternity. The cosmos circles endlessly, the same patterns repeating, the planets returning to the same positions, seasons cycling, day following night following day. This repetition creates a kind of permanence within change. The cosmos is not eternal, but it is everlasting. It had a beginning when the craftsman organized it, but it has no end. It will continue forever, cycling through the same patterns, its motions never stopping. This is as close to eternity as a physical thing can come. The heavens are the visible embodiment of time. Sun, moon, planets, stars all move in mathematically precise patterns. Their motions define years and months and days. Before the heavens were organized, there was no way to measure time, no distinction between past and present and future in any meaningful sense. Time requires change, but it requires ordered change, change that follows patterns, that can be measured and predicted. The craftsman made time by making these celestial motions regular. The year is defined by the sun's path, the month by the moon's cycle, the day by the rotation of the heavens. Time itself is physical motion made regular, made mathematical, made intelligible. But why did the craftsman create the cosmos at all? The question is misleading. The craftsman did not create at some particular moment in time, because time itself was created along with the cosmos. There was no before in any temporal sense. The act of creation is not an event within time, but the establishment of time itself. The motivation was goodness. The craftsman, being good, wanted to make something as good and beautiful as possible. The eternal forms are perfectly good and beautiful, but they are not physical. The craftsman could not create another realm of forms. That realm simply is beyond creation. But the craftsman could create a physical world that resembles the forms, that embodies their patterns in matter, that makes eternal realities visible. So the cosmos is a kind of image of eternity, a temporal reflection of timeless reality. Looking at the ordered heavens, at the mathematical precision of celestial motions, at the beauty and regularity of the natural world, you can glimpse something of the eternal forms that serve as its model. This story is not literal truth. Plato makes this clear. He calls it a likely account, a myth. A story that approximates truth without claiming to be completely accurate. The craftsman, the demiurge, is not a person in any ordinary sense, not a being who thinks and plans and acts at particular moments. The story uses temporal language to describe relationships that are not really temporal. But the core ideas are serious philosophy. The cosmos is ordered, not chaotic. Its order reflects eternal patterns. Physical reality resembles the forms, participates in them, is made intelligible by them. The cosmos is good, beautiful, as close to perfection as anything physical can be. The creation of living beings follows the same pattern. The craftsman made the world soul and the body of the cosmos. Then lesser gods created by the craftsman made individual souls and bodies. Humans, animals, plants, all have souls of varying complexity. All participate in the life of the cosmos as a whole. Human souls have a special position. They are rational souls, capable of understanding, of grasping mathematical truths, potentially of perceiving the forms. Each soul was assigned to a star, shown the nature of the universe, educated in truth. Then each soul was placed in a body on earth. This embodiment is traumatic. The soul, accustomed to contemplating eternal truths, is suddenly overwhelmed by physical sensations. Pain, pleasure, hunger, thirst, all the chaotic inputs of bodily existence flood in. The soul forgets what it knew, becomes confused, gets lost in the physical world. The task of human life is to overcome this confusion, to remember what the soul knew before embodiment, to reorient toward eternal truth. This requires education, requires training in mathematics and philosophy, requires turning away from the chaos of sense experience toward the order of intelligible reality. Some souls succeed. They live philosophically, govern their bodies with reason, achieve understanding of the forms. When these souls die and are freed from their bodies, they return to their assigned stars, living in happiness, contemplating truth without the interference of physical sensation. Other souls fail. They are ruled by appetites, enslaved to bodily desires, never achieving rational control. When these souls die, they are reincarnated in appropriate bodies. A soul that lived for physical pleasure might become an animal. A soul that lived foolishly might become a bird. The form of the next body reflects the character the soul developed in the previous life. But even these failed souls have hope. Reincarnation provides new opportunities. The soul that became an animal might, through countless lifetimes, gradually develop better character, eventually earning another human body, another chance at philosophical life. The cycle continues until the soul finally achieves wisdom and escapes to its star. The cosmos as a whole has a purpose. It exists to display the forms in physical reality, to make eternal truth visible, to provide an arena where souls can develop and learn. Everything in it serves this purpose. The regular motions of the heavens teach mathematical order. The beauty of nature points toward the form of beauty. The intelligibility of physical laws demonstrates that reason governs reality. Even evil and disorder serve the purpose indirectly. They show what happens when order breaks down, when matter resists the imposition of form, when souls fail to govern their bodies properly. The contrast between order and disorder, between cosmos and chaos, makes the value of order clear. The craftsman did the best possible with the materials available. Matter has its own nature, its own tendencies, its own resistance to being shaped. It cannot perfectly embody the forms. There will always be imperfection, always some chaos remaining in the cosmos, always some gap between the physical world and the eternal patterns it imitates. This explains why bad things happen, not because the craftsman is evil or incompetent or indifferent, but because perfection is impossible in the physical realm. The cosmos is as good as any physical thing can be, but it is still physical, still subject to change and decay and imperfection. The mathematical structure of the cosmos reveals the craftsman's intelligence. The proportions used in creating the world soul, the geometric relationships governing the elements, the regular motions of celestial bodies, all demonstrate rational design. This is not random, this is not accident, this is mind imposing order on matter. Understanding this design requires mathematical education. The person ignorant of mathematics looks at the heavens and sees lights moving randomly. The person educated in mathematics sees precise patterns, sees numerical relationships, sees order. The cosmos reveals its nature only to those prepared to understand it. Time, as the moving image of eternity, has a peculiar relationship to truth. Eternal truths are timelessly true. Mathematical proofs do not become true at some moment and then stop being true later. They simply are true, always, in the eternal now of the forms. But physical truths are temporal. This apple is ripe now, was unripe yesterday, will be rotten tomorrow. These facts exist in time, change over time, are not eternal. Yet they are not completely arbitrary either. The apple follows patterns, develops according to its nature, participates in the form of apple. The cosmos mediates between eternity and pure chaos. It is not eternal, but it is not chaotic. It exists in time, but its time is ordered, mathematical, regular. This makes knowledge of the physical world possible, though such knowledge is inferior to knowledge of the forms. Astronomy studies this temporal order, not the physical stars themselves, which are just fire, but the mathematical patterns their motions follow. These patterns are eternal, even though the particular positions of planets at any moment are temporal. Understanding the patterns brings you closer to understanding the eternal mind that designed them. The craftsman, having made the cosmos as good as possible, now sustains it. Not through constant intervention, but through the order built into it from the beginning. The mathematical laws governing motion, the natural tendencies of elements, the souls animating living beings, all continue operating according to their initial design. This cosmos will never be destroyed. It had a beginning but has no end. The craftsman made it to endure eternally, cycling through the same patterns forever. Other worlds may exist elsewhere, but this cosmos is unique, perfect in its kind, the visible embodiment of invisible truth. Human souls participate in this cosmic order. We are not separate from the cosmos, but parts of it, smaller souls within the larger world soul. Our task is to align ourselves with cosmic order, to make our individual souls reflect the same mathematical harmonies that govern the heavens. When we achieve this, we live well, happily, in accordance with nature and with truth. Most people think the good life is the pleasant life. They pursue pleasure and avoid pain. They make decisions based on what will bring them enjoyment. This seems obvious, hardly worth questioning. But examine it closely and problems appear. First, pleasures conflict with each other. The pleasure of eating rich food conflicts with the pleasure of being healthy. The pleasure of staying in bed conflicts with the pleasure of accomplishment. The pleasure of immediate gratification conflicts with the pleasure of achieving long-term goals. You cannot have all pleasures simultaneously. Choices must be made. How do you choose between pleasures? The common answer is to take the greater pleasure, avoid the greater pain. But how do you measure? Pleasures differ in intensity, duration, and consequences. A very intense pleasure might last only moments. A moderate pleasure might endure for hours. Which is greater? There is no obvious way to calculate. Worse, pleasures depend on prior pains. Food is pleasant only when you are hungry. Rest is pleasant only when you are tired. Sexual pleasure requires prior desire, which is itself a kind of pain, an uncomfortable want seeking satisfaction. Scratch an itch, and the scratching feels good, but only because the itch hurt. The pleasure is just the cessation of pain. This means many pleasures are not really positive states. They are just the absence of pain, the filling of a lack, the relief of discomfort. When you drink because you are thirsty, the pleasure is your thirst being quenched. When you eat because you are hungry, the pleasure is your hunger being satisfied. You return to neutral, to the state you were in before the pain arose. Is this really pleasure, or is it just the elimination of suffering? True pleasure should be a positive addition to your state, not merely a return to how you were before. But most bodily pleasures are this restorative kind. They feel good because they stop something from feeling bad. Some pleasures do seem genuinely positive. The pleasure of learning something new, of solving a difficult problem, of understanding a complex idea. These do not depend on prior pain. You were not suffering from ignorance in a way that felt bad, then experienced relief when you learned. The pleasure of learning is a positive addition to your state. Or consider the pleasure of perceiving beauty. Looking at a beautiful landscape or hearing beautiful music creates pleasure that does not depend on prior deprivation. You were not in pain before seeing the beauty. The beauty adds something positive to your experience. These intellectual and aesthetic pleasures differ fundamentally from bodily pleasures. They do not involve filling a lack. They do not require prior pain to make them pleasant. They are pure additions, positive states, rather than mere returns to neutral. Also, these higher pleasures are more lasting. The pleasure of a good meal fades quickly. Within hours you are hungry again, need more food, seek the same pleasure again in an endless cycle. But the pleasure of understanding remains. Once you grasp a mathematical proof, that understanding stays with you. The pleasure does not require constant renewal. Higher pleasures are also more reliable. Bodily pleasures depend on circumstances beyond your control. Food tastes good only if it is prepared well, if you are hungry but not too hungry, if your health is good, if many conditions are met. But intellectual pleasure depends only on your mind. No external circumstances can prevent you from thinking through an argument or recalling a beautiful idea. This suggests a hierarchy of pleasures. At the bottom are false pleasures, experiences that seem pleasant only because they stop pain. These include most bodily pleasures. In the middle are mixed pleasures, experiences that combine genuine pleasure with some element of pain or lack. At the top are pure pleasures, experiences that add positive value without depending on prior deprivation. But even if we identify pure pleasures, does this mean the good life is the maximally pleasant life? Not necessarily. Pleasure is not the same as goodness. Some pleasures are bad. The tyrant experiences intense pleasure from exercising absolute power, from indulging every whim, from having no restraint on his desires. But the tyrant's life is not good. It is wretched, fearful, enslaved to appetite. The criminal experiences pleasure from successful crimes. The glutton experiences pleasure from overeating. The lazy person experiences pleasure from avoiding all effort. These pleasures are real. The people experiencing them genuinely feel good in the moment, but their lives are not good lives. Pleasure without wisdom, without virtue, without proper ordering of the soul leads to misery. On the other hand, a life without any pleasure seems inhuman. Pure reason without any positive feeling, pure virtue without any enjoyment, this would be the life of a calculating machine, not a human being. Humans have bodies, have emotions, have the capacity for enjoyment. A good human life should include appropriate pleasures. The solution is a mixed life, combining wisdom with pleasure. Not all pleasures, but the right pleasures. Not pleasure as the goal, but pleasure as the accompaniment to proper activity. The philosopher experiences pleasure in understanding. The just person experiences pleasure in acting justly. The temperate person experiences moderate bodily pleasures without being controlled by them. This mixed life is better than either a life of pure pleasure or a life of pure reason. Pure pleasure without wisdom is the life of an animal or a fool. Pure reason without pleasure is not really possible for embodied humans, and if it were possible, would be the life of a god rather than a person. The human good is specifically human, appropriate to beings who are neither purely rational nor purely appetitive, but some combination. Knowledge remains more important than pleasure in this mixture. Given a choice between pleasure and wisdom, wisdom must win, but the choice rarely comes in this stark form. Usually the question is which pleasures to pursue, how much to indulge, when to restrain. Knowledge answers these questions. Wisdom guides the pursuit of pleasure rather than being opposed to it. The wise person experiences more pleasure than the fool, not less. This seems counterintuitive. Surely the person who indulges every desire experiences more pleasure than the person who restrains themselves. But no, The fool's pleasures are mostly false, are restorations of prior pains, are followed by regret and suffering. The wise person's pleasures are pure, are genuine additions to their state, bring no regrets. Also, the fool cannot really enjoy even bodily pleasures properly. The glutton ruins their health and their food stops tasting good. The person who never restrains sexual desire becomes jaded and finds less pleasure in it. The person who sleeps excessively finds sleep less refreshing. Appetite indulged without limit destroys its own satisfaction. The temperate person who indulges moderately, who eats when hungry but not to excess, who sleeps enough but not too much, who enjoys bodily pleasures within rational limits, experiences these pleasures more intensely and more reliably than the person who never restrains themselves. And the temperate person adds to these moderate bodily pleasures all the intellectual and aesthetic pleasures that the fool never experiences. The fool does not know the pleasure of understanding, of solving problems, of perceiving beauty in mathematics or philosophy. The fool's range of pleasures is narrower, even though they pursue pleasure more desperately. Pain has a similar structure to pleasure. Some pains are genuine evils, real subtractions from your well-being. Torture, severe injury, agonizing disease, these are bad in themselves. But many pains are necessary for greater goods. The pain of exercise produces health. The pain of difficult study produces understanding. The pain of resisting temptation produces virtue. The wise person accepts necessary pains without complaint, not because pain is good, but because what comes from it is good. The fool avoids all pain and therefore misses goods that require painful effort to achieve. The fool thinks they are pursuing pleasure, but their avoidance of all discomfort prevents them from reaching the greatest pleasures. This creates a paradox. The person who pursues pleasure as their primary goal achieves less pleasure than the person who pursues wisdom and accepts pleasure as a byproduct. The direct pursuit of pleasure fails. The indirect pursuit succeeds. Why? Because pleasure is not self-sufficient. It requires objects, activities, circumstances. The pleasure of eating requires food. The pleasure of learning requires truth to learn. The pleasure of perceiving beauty requires beautiful objects. If you pursue pleasure itself, you have no guidance about which objects to pursue, which activities to engage in, which circumstances to create. You grab at whatever seems pleasant in the moment and often end up with pains disguised as pleasures. But if you pursue wisdom, pursue understanding of the forms, pursue knowledge of what is truly good, the right pleasures follow naturally. You take pleasure in your studies because studying is genuinely pleasant when done well. You take pleasure in just actions because justice is beautiful and perceiving beauty is pleasant. You take moderate pleasure in bodily satisfactions because you understand their proper role in human life. The good life, then, is not the pleasant life but the wise life. And the wise life turns out to be more pleasant than the supposedly pleasant life of the fool. This is not a compromise or a consolation prize. It is the recognition that pleasure and wisdom, rightly understood, go together rather than conflicting. The forms of the good is not pleasure. It is not even primarily about producing pleasure. It is the principle of reality, of being, of perfection. But because humans are the kind of beings we are, rational souls in bodies, perceiving the good and living according to it produces the deepest and most reliable pleasures available to us. Most people reverse this. They think pleasure is the good, that whatever produces pleasure is worth pursuing. This leads them into contradiction and misery. They pursue pleasures that conflict with each other, that require prior pains to exist, that bring regret and suffering in their wake. They never achieve what they claim to want. The philosophical life offers a different path. Pursue truth, pursue wisdom, pursue understanding of the forms. Let pleasure come as it will from these pursuits. Do not chase it directly, but do not reject it when it accompanies proper activity. Accept that embodied human life requires some bodily pleasure, that complete asceticism is inhuman. But keep pleasure in its proper place, as the accompaniment to the good life rather than its goal. This balanced view avoids two extremes. One extreme is hedonism, the doctrine that pleasure is the only good and should be pursued directly. The other extreme is asceticism, the doctrine that all pleasure is suspect and should be avoided. Both are wrong. Pleasure is good when it accompanies the right activities and comes from the right sources. Pleasure is bad when it is pursued for its own sake or when it comes from base sources. Knowing the difference requires philosophy, requires understanding what human nature is, what the soul is, how reason should relate to appetite and spirit. Without this knowledge, you cannot distinguish good pleasures from bad, necessary pains from unnecessary ones, activities worth pursuing from activities worth avoiding. The good life is therefore the examined life, the life guided by understanding rather than impulse. Such a life is pleasant, more pleasant than any alternative, but its pleasantness is a consequence of its being good, not the reason it is good. In the academy, behind closed doors, Plato taught things he never wrote down. His students heard lectures that the general public did not. Years later, some of these students wrote reports of what they heard. The reports are fragmentary, difficult to interpret, sometimes contradictory, but they suggest that Plato's deepest philosophy remained oral, deliberately kept out of the dialogues. Why keep the most important teachings unwritten? The answer connects to what was already discussed about writing's limitations. The highest truths are too subtle for writing, too easily misunderstood, too dangerous in unprepared hands. They require extensive preparation to understand, require years of mathematical training, require the kind of guidance that only personal instruction can provide. The written dialogues prepare students for these oral teachings. They train minds in dialectical thinking, demonstrate methods of inquiry, point toward deeper questions. But they do not answer the deepest questions. They cannot, because writing cannot do what is needed. The final steps must be taken in person, through direct instruction, through conversations that can adapt to each student's specific confusions and insights. What were these unwritten doctrines? The reports are unclear, but certain themes appear repeatedly. Something about first principles, about what lies beyond even the forms, something about the one and the indefinite dyad, something about how forms relate to numbers, something about the generation of everything from ultimate principles. The one seems to be the highest principle, beyond even the form of the good, or perhaps identical to it. The one is absolute unity, absolute simplicity, the principle from which all multiplicity derives. It is not a thing, not even a form in the normal sense. It is more fundamental than anything that can be said about it. All language, all concepts, all distinctions depend on it, but cannot capture it. Opposite the one stands the indefinite dyad, the principle of multiplicity, of difference, of unlimited variation. Where the one is limit and determination, the dyad is unlimited and indeterminate. It is the principle of more and less, of continuous variation, of the potential for things to differ from each other. Everything else derives from these two principles. The forms themselves are generated by the interaction of the one and the dyad. Numbers come first, emerging from the imposition of limit on the unlimited. Then mathematical objects, then forms, then souls, then physical things. Each level is further from the ultimate principles, less unified, more mixed with multiplicity. This sounds abstract to the point of meaninglessness. What does it mean to say the one and the dyad generate forms? The reports give few details, and what they give is difficult to interpret. Plato apparently used mathematical language, talked about ratios and proportions and geometric relationships, but the exact arguments remain lost. One theme that appears clearly is the importance of number. The Pythagoreans believed everything is number. Plato seems to have adopted a version of this view, but more sophisticated. Not that things are literally made of numbers, but that numerical relationships structure reality at every level. The forms have a mathematical structure. Souls have a mathematical structure. Even physical things reflect mathematical patterns. This makes mathematics more than just educational preparation. Mathematics reveals the actual structure of reality. When you study geometry or arithmetic, you are not just training your mind. You are discovering truths about how the forms relate to each other, how the cosmos is organized, how everything derives from first principles. The one has special significance. It is not the number one, not a quantity, but the principle of unity itself. Everything that exists is one thing rather than many things. This table is one table, not two half tables or a million atoms. Its unity is real, makes it what it is. Where does this unity come from? From the one, the principle that makes anything be one thing rather than dissolving into multiplicity. But everything is also multiple. The table is one table, but it has many parts, many properties, many relationships to other things. It is both one and many. This combination of unity and multiplicity requires both principles. The one provides unity. The dyad provides multiplicity. Their interaction produces everything that exists. At the level of forms, this becomes more complex. Each form is one, is itself, and not something else. The form of beauty is one thing, distinct from the form of justice. But forms also have internal structure, have relationships to each other, participate in each other in complex ways. This structure apparently has a mathematical nature that Plato explored in his oral teachings. The form of the good seems to relate to the one. Perhaps they are identical. Perhaps the one is the ultimate aspect of the good. Or perhaps the good is the highest form, and the one is something beyond even forms. The reports are unclear, possibly because Plato himself remained uncertain, or because different students understood him differently. Whatever the exact relationship, the highest reality is simple, unified, beyond all complexity and multiplicity. Knowledge of this highest reality is the culmination of philosophical education. The person who grasps the One, who understands how everything derives from ultimate principles, has achieved the deepest possible understanding. But this knowledge cannot be written down, partly because language inherently involves multiplicity, involves making distinctions, involves concepts that divide reality into categories. To speak of the One is already to make it multiple, to distinguish it from the dyad, to place it in relation to other things. The highest reality transcends all such distinctions. Also, understanding the One requires a kind of direct intellectual perception that goes beyond discursive reasoning. You cannot argue your way to it step by step, cannot prove it through logic, cannot deduce it from premises. You must see it directly, must have an insight that goes beyond language and concepts. This insight can be facilitated by teaching, by mathematical preparation, by dialectical training, but it cannot be produced by reading a text. Plato apparently gave a public lecture once on the good. The audience expected practical guidance about ethics, about how to live well. Instead, he gave a highly mathematical lecture about the One, about numbers, about abstract principles. Most of the audience left confused and disappointed. This story, if true, shows the gap between what most people want from philosophy and what philosophy actually offers at its highest level. The unwritten doctrines were not for everyone. They were for advanced students who had completed years of mathematical training, who had mastered dialectic, who had demonstrated the intellectual capacity and moral character needed for the highest teaching. These students could understand what would only confuse beginners. This creates an elitist structure to Platonic philosophy. There is exoteric philosophy, the teachings available to anyone who reads the dialogues, and esoteric philosophy, the teachings reserved for qualified students. The exoteric teaches important truths, but the deepest truths remain esoteric. This bothers modern readers who value equality and accessibility. Should not truth be available to everyone? Should not the highest knowledge be public? But Plato would say truth is available to everyone willing to do the necessary preparation. The problem is not deliberate exclusion, but natural limitation. Most people cannot or will not undertake the decades of study required to grasp the highest principles. Moreover, sharing these principles with unprepared people accomplishes nothing positive and risks harm. The person without mathematical training will misunderstand, will take metaphors literally or literal claims metaphorically, will extract wrong conclusions. They might think they understand when they actually do not, which is worse than knowing they are ignorant. Or they might become sophists, using fragments of philosophical vocabulary to sound wise without being wise, manipulating others with half-understood concepts. This happened frequently. People who studied a little philosophy then went around teaching for money, claiming expertise they did not possess, corrupting students with false versions of true doctrines. The oral teachings also allowed flexibility. In conversation, Plato could adapt to each student's level, could give different explanations to different people, could use examples and analogies suited to particular individuals. Written texts cannot do this. They say the same thing to everyone, prepared or not. The emphasis on the One and the dyad may seem strange, may seem like an abandonment of the theory of forms for some kind of mystical numerology, but it is better understood as a development, an attempt to answer questions that the theory of forms raises but does not resolve. If there are many forms, what makes them a unified system rather than a random collection? If forms are eternal and perfect, where do they come from? If mathematical objects are important for understanding reality, how exactly do they relate to forms? The unwritten doctrines apparently address these questions by positing ultimate principles from which forms themselves derive. This does not eliminate the forms. It provides a foundation for them, explains how they can exist, shows how they relate to each other. The forms remain crucial for understanding physical reality, for knowledge, for ethics and politics, but they are no longer the ultimate level of reality. Something lies beyond them. The student who grasped these ultimate principles could then understand everything else more deeply. The forms would make sense as manifestations of the One limited by the dyad. Mathematics would be understood as the first level of this manifestation. Physical things would be seen as distant reflections of principles operating at every level of reality. But we cannot know exactly what Plato taught because he deliberately did not write it down. We have fragments, reports, hints in the dialogues. We can see that something important was being taught orally. We can glimpse the themes, unity and multiplicity, mathematical structure, first principles beyond the forms, but the details remain lost. Some scholars think this is a disaster, that Plato's most important work is irretrievably gone. Others think the loss is less significant, that the written dialogues contain what matters most, that the oral teachings were variations on themes already present in the texts. Still others think the obscurity is deliberate, that Plato wanted future readers to struggle with hints and fragments rather than being given complete answers. The truth probably lies somewhere between these positions. The unwritten doctrines were important, represented Plato's deepest thinking about ultimate questions, but they built on the foundation presented in the dialogues. They were not a completely different philosophy, but an extension, a completion, a final ascent beyond what writing could express. For readers today, this means we must accept incompleteness. We cannot fully reconstruct Plato's philosophy because crucial parts were never written down. We can understand his ethics, his political theory, his theory of forms, his views on education and art and the soul. But the ultimate metaphysical system, the final account of reality's deepest structure, remains partially hidden. Perhaps this is appropriate. Perhaps philosophy at its highest level cannot be fully communicated in writing, cannot be transmitted across centuries through texts, requires living teachers and students working together. If so, then what we have in Plato's dialogues is exactly what he intended us to have. Not complete doctrine, but an invitation to philosophy, tools for thinking, demonstrations of method, enough to begin the journey, even if the final destination must be reached through means other than reading. At age 17, Aristotle came to Athens and joined Plato's academy. He stayed for 20 years, studying under Plato, becoming one of the most brilliant students the academy produced. When Plato died, Aristotle was in his late 30s, fully formed as a thinker, ready to develop his own philosophy. He left Athens and eventually founded his own school, the Lyceum. The relationship between their philosophies is complex. Aristotle learned everything from Plato, absorbed the theory of forms, the emphasis on mathematics, the dialectical method, but he rejected much of what he learned, developed alternative theories, criticized his teacher's central doctrines. The student became the rival, creating a competing vision of philosophy that would influence Western thought as much as Plato's own. Aristotle's most fundamental disagreement concerned the forms. He accepted that we need universals, that we recognize qualities shared by multiple things, that knowledge requires something stable to know. But he denied that forms exist separately from physical things, in some other realm accessible only to reason. Instead, Aristotle argued that universals exist in the things themselves. The form of horse is not in some separate realm, but in actual horses. Every horse embodies the universal, makes it real through its existence. The universal has no reality apart from the particulars that instantiate it. When all horses die, if that ever happens, the form of horse ceases to exist. This seems like a small technical disagreement, but it transforms everything. For Plato, the physical world is fundamentally inferior to the realm of forms, is shadows and copies, is less real than the eternal patterns. For Aristotle, the physical world is fully real, is where universals actually exist, is not inferior to anything. This shifts philosophy's focus. Plato turned away from the physical world toward eternal truths accessible to pure reason. Aristotle turned toward the physical world, toward observation and classification, and understanding how actual things work. Plato valued mathematics. Aristotle valued biology, studying animals and plants, observing their structures and behaviors, understanding them in their own terms, rather than as poor copies of eternal forms. Aristotle also rejected the theory of recollection. Knowledge does not come from remembering what the soul knew before birth. It comes from experience, from observing particulars and extracting universals from them. You see many horses and notice what they have in common, forming the concept of horseness. This is abstraction, not recollection. This makes the soul's relationship to the body completely different. For Plato, the soul is trapped in the body, longs to escape, achieves true knowledge only by turning away from physical sensation. For Aristotle, the soul is the form of the body, is inseparable from it during life, achieves knowledge precisely through the senses that Plato distrusted. Political philosophy changes accordingly. Plato designed an ideal city ruled by philosophers who have escaped the cave, who know the forms, who understand eternal truth. Aristotle studied actual cities, compared different constitutions, looked for what works in practice rather than designing perfect systems that ignore human nature. Aristotle agreed that the good life requires virtue, requires proper ordering of the soul, but he defined virtue differently. For Plato, virtue is knowledge. If you truly know what is good, you will do it. Vice comes from ignorance. For Aristotle, virtue is habit. You become courageous by practicing courage, become just by performing just actions. Knowledge helps, but it is not sufficient. Character must be formed through repeated action. This makes ethics more practical, more focused on how actual people develop good character. Aristotle gives detailed analyses of particular virtues, of courage and temperance and justice and generosity. He considers when these virtues apply, how they relate to emotions, how they avoid extremes in both directions. His ethics is meant to guide action, not just to describe ideal forms. On pleasure, Aristotle again disagreed. Plato was suspicious of pleasure, thought most pleasures are false, preferred the philosophical life that transcends concern with pleasure and pain. Aristotle thought pleasure is good, is the natural accompaniment to proper activity, is part of human flourishing rather than opposed to it. The virtuous person takes pleasure in virtuous actions, and this pleasure is entirely appropriate. In studying nature, Aristotle developed concepts Plato never used. He distinguished matter from form in individual things. Every physical object is a combination of matter, the stuff it is made from, and form, the organization that makes it what it is. A bronze statue is bronze matter organized in the form of a human figure. The same matter could take different forms. The same form could be realized in different matter. This matter-form analysis applies to everything. An animal is matter organized in a certain form that makes it alive, that gives it the capacities characteristic of its species. When the animal dies, the same matter remains but loses that form, no longer functions as a unified living being. The soul is the form of a living body, what organizes it and makes it capable of life. Aristotle also analyzed causation more carefully than Plato. Every change has 4 types of causes. The material cause, what something is made from. The formal cause, what kind of thing it is. The efficient cause, what brought it into existence. And the final cause, what purpose it serves. Understanding anything fully requires grasping all 4 causes. This teleological thinking, the emphasis on final causes and purposes, pervades Aristotle's philosophy. Everything in nature has a purpose, a goal it is oriented toward. The acorn's purpose is to become an oak tree. The eye's purpose is to see. The human being's purpose is to live rationally, to exercise the distinctively human capacities. Plato had purposes too, connected to the forms. Physical things aim imperfectly at embodying forms, but Aristotle's purposes are immanent, built into the things themselves rather than existing in a separate realm. The oak tree does not grow because it is trying to imitate the form of oak. It grows because becoming an oak tree is its nature, its built-in purpose. On the cosmos, Aristotle accepted an eternal universe rather than one created by a demiurge. The heavens move eternally in perfect circles, as Plato thought, but they were never created. They have always existed, will always exist. Change happens in the sublunary realm, the region below the moon, but the heavens are perfect and unchanging. Motion requires a first mover, something that causes motion without itself moving. Aristotle's unmoved mover is pure thought thinking itself. Perfect actuality with no potential for change. It moves the cosmos not by pushing or pulling, but by being an object of love and desire, by inspiring the heavens to move in imitation of its perfection. This is quite different from Plato's demiurge. The unmoved mover does not create, does not plan, does not care about the cosmos. It is simply perfect being, and the cosmos naturally orients toward it. There is no craftsman looking at forms and imposing order on chaos. There is eternal motion drawn toward eternal perfection. In logic, Aristotle developed formal systems Plato never attempted. He created syllogistic logic, analyzing argument forms, distinguishing valid from invalid inferences, providing rules for correct reasoning. This systematization went far beyond Plato's dialectical method, creating tools that would dominate logic for 2,000 years. Yet Aristotle never claimed to be rejecting Plato entirely. He saw himself as correcting errors, improving on insights, developing philosophy further. In many areas he agreed with Plato. Both valued reason over appetite. Both thought the good life requires virtue and philosophical understanding. Both considered most people incapable of the highest intellectual achievements. Both designed educational systems emphasizing mathematics and logic. The disagreements, though profound, happened within a shared framework. Both were responding to Socrates, both trying to answer the questions he raised. Both rejected sophistry and moral relativism. Both thought truth is objective and knowledge is possible. Both valued philosophy as the highest human activity. Later tradition would see them as opposites. Raphael's famous painting shows Plato pointing up toward the heavens, Aristotle pointing down toward the earth. The image captures something real. Plato emphasized transcendent forms, Aristotle emphasized immanent forms. Plato looked beyond the physical world, Aristotle studied it intensely. Plato valued mathematics, Aristotle valued biology. But the opposition can be exaggerated. Plato cared about the physical world, wrote extensively about its structure and the proper organization of cities. Aristotle believed in something beyond the physical, in the unmoved mover and in the rational soul's capacity to grasp eternal truths. They differed on emphasis and method more than on fundamental goals. The rivalry shaped both philosophies. Aristotle developed his ideas partly in response to Plato, clarifying his own views by contrasting them with his teachers. Later Platonists responded to Aristotle, defending the theory of forms against his criticisms, adapting some of his concepts while rejecting others. The dialogue continued for centuries, each school learning from the other, even while competing. For understanding Plato, Aristotle's criticisms are valuable. He studied under Plato for 20 years, heard the oral teachings, understood the theory of forms as well as anyone could. When he says the theory has problems, we should pay attention. His objections reveal difficulties Plato may not have fully resolved, questions that remain open, areas where the theory needs development or defense. At the same time, Aristotle sometimes misunderstood or caricatured Plato's views. He criticized simplified versions of the theory of forms, not necessarily the complex reality of Plato's actual teaching. His objections work better against crude Platonism than against Plato himself. The student-rival relationship is philosophically productive. Agreement teaches less than disagreement. Aristotle forced Platonists to sharpen their arguments, to address objections, to clarify what the theory of forms really claims. Plato, had he lived to see Aristotle's mature philosophy, might have learned from it, might have modified his own views in response. This pattern repeats throughout philosophy's history. Great thinkers often emerge from opposition to their teachers. The student absorbs everything, then rebels, develops alternatives, creates a competing system. The rebellion is never complete. Too much of the teacher's influence remains, shaping even the student's objections. But the independence is real. Something genuinely new emerges from the confrontation. Plato and Aristotle together define the range of Western philosophy. Nearly every later philosopher falls somewhere between them or combines elements from both. The questions they raised remain central. The concepts they developed still structure philosophical debates. Their rivalry, far from being a footnote, is one of the most productive intellectual relationships in history. 24 centuries have passed since Socrates stood trial before 500 Athenian citizens. The charges were impiety and corrupting the youth. The real crime was asking questions that made people uncomfortable, that exposed their ignorance, that threatened the comfortable certainties they lived by. Athens killed him for it. Plato spent 50 years trying to answer a single question. How does a city end up executing its wisest citizen? His answer reshaped Western civilization. Not just philosophy, but science, art, politics, religion, education. The theory of forms influenced Christian theology's understanding of God and eternity. Renaissance artists worked within frameworks he established. Modern democracies still struggle with his critique of majority rule. Mathematicians and scientists pursue truth using methods he helped create. Every university traces its ancestry to the academy he founded. We still argue his questions. What is real? What can we know? Who should govern? How should we live? What happens when we die? Does justice exist objectively, or is it merely convention? Are our strongest desires pointing towards something real, or are we chasing illusions? Is the physical world all there is, or does something permanent exist beyond the constant change we perceive? These are not questions that admit final answers. Each generation must work through them anew, but we cannot escape them. They are the fundamental questions of human existence, and Plato was the first to articulate them with such clarity and power that they remain inescapable. The cave imagery still captures something profound about the human condition. We mistake shadows for reality. We resist being led toward truth. We trust what is familiar over what is real. The person who has seen something more finds it difficult to explain to those who have not. And attempts to force enlightenment often end badly, sometimes fatally. Athens killed Socrates for asking questions. Plato answered them, built a philosophy, founded a school, wrote dialogues that people still read. But he ensured we would never stop asking. That was his ultimate tribute to the teacher he never forgot.